Sherry Cliff, retired business consultant.
Kristen Zero, I'm one of the labor and collection attorneys.
As I said, I'm Bill Shallon, one of the project powers, and on behalf of the committee, we all are really glad to be here, although it is somewhat of a daunting task. There's a lot to cover and not a whole lot of time to cover it. I'll have a few remarks in a minute, but Greg Anderson wanted to address the committee about his dual sort of responsibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the committee. First of all, to say how important this is. And y'all probably know we've got the budget coming up. So I'm encouraging the committee and I'll participate as I can to have any recommendations done quickly. We've got a budget hold bill, and so anything that we can do sooner rather than later will be important. I encourage you to try to finish your work by the August. The second thing is that I'm serving in a unique role here. Those of you who have not been involved in sort of the sunshine issues in the past know that come into play here, but particularly as I look at my role on council, I want to make sure that I'm not taking a position here which would conflict me in any way on any votes that I might have to take. And so when we get down the road and we're taking votes on positions, then I'll probably be abstaining from that. And I hope you understand. And Peggy, you're here, and I don't know if I've done a good enough job to explain that.
This is a statement from the chair.
Peggy Sidman, Officer General Counsel. Thank you. Councilmember Anderson had asked me to come just to share with you, in his role as a council member, from time to time, he may be participating in impasse hearings in which he would act as a judge. And when he acts as a judge, he has to maintain all impartiality, so he couldn't take a position that would show direction one way or the other. And so to that extent, he wanted to clarify if there were anything like that might come up, that he would be abstaining from taking such a position.
Greg, and Greg explained to me that doesn't mean people not articulate views on various things. They won't take a position, but we sure would like his response as we go along.
As long as it couldn't be characterized as taking a position in favor or opposed to anything that may come in front of him, because if he were to do that, then he could be disqualified from participating in any such vote. So, thank you.
Right. And if he's posted out, I hope you'll remind us so that he doesn't fall into that.
Yes, and Cindy Laquadera is here as well that can assist. Are you going to be doing that today? Okay.
Thank you. Sure, thank you. As y'all know, the mayor has asked us as people from the community to review his proposed pension reform plan and make recommendations to him. As I told each of you, as the mayor and the mayor's chief of staff, this is a pretty independent group of people. We're going to be independent work here. So we are free to decide anything or nothing as far as we want to do. We are not bound to a plan. We are bound to evaluate it. From our recommendations, this is a true committee. It is not an in-house sort of thing. I want everybody to understand that. Even though it's the mayor that has made this request, it seems to me that we're here really listening on behalf of the community to these presentations. We are speaking for the community in some sense if we speak for the women's group. We've had much material distributed to us. I know y'all have read every bit of it so far, but I think we've had a good foundation laid for our work today. It's a real fast process because of summer schedules, number one. Number two, because of the city council's statutory requirement. So we really need to give the mayor and the community our advice, even though it will be difficult. But we can still give our best advice, hopefully by our last meeting in August, to Today will be a day of foundation laying. We're having presentations by representatives from the administration, from the general counsel's office, from the civic council, from the sheriff, from the fire chief, and I think that's all of the number. But it is an important task. As we begin to hear the presentations, it seems to me, as I've been reading over the last couple of weeks, that one thing that has been somewhat lost in the shuffle of the public debate and going back and forth are a couple of constraints that are real constraints. Number one, from the material we've learned that of the $2.4 billion of unfunded liabilities, somewhere between 70% and 90% relate to existing retired persons whose rights have vested and to current employees whose rights have vested. That's somewhere between 70 and 90%. So one thing, we get a lot of suggestions that we do this, that the mayor do this, and do that, the council do this and do that. But it's important to remember that we can't compel people with vested rights to do something unless they want to do it. So we need to, if we are evaluating things, we need to keep that in mind. The second thing is the legal constraint of where we are. There is a lawsuit pending. I apologize, I'm a lawyer, I think like a lawyer. The lawsuit is between the pension fund trustees and the city of Jacksonville to construe and to determine the validity, effectiveness, and enforceability of what is popularly called a 30-year agreement. That's basically the existing pension arrangement between the trustees and the city of Jacksonville. And that is a framework. The city takes the position that that agreement, well, the position of the lawsuit, I don't want to characterize it because of the mediation, but their position in the lawsuit was that that agreement was not binding and that the city should be, under the appropriate statutory and constitutional law, be entitled to collectively bargain with the employees of the city every 3 years. And the pension trustees take the position, no, that is a valid and enforceable agreement, and the judge will tell the city to be bound by. That is the legal dispute before us. And it is a real dispute, and both sides think that they have strengths, and both sides think that they have weaknesses. And that's why in Florida, particularly, mediation is a particularly effective tool to bring parties together to try to settle cases, because they can control their own destiny much more than the judges tell them to do so. So as Ms. Lacavera told the council, one thing we need to evaluate is, well, what would we get if we could, if we win, what would we lose if we lose, and as we evaluate the settlement. So that's important to keep in mind, because we're not like a city council starting anew with trying to write a new pension plan. We've got something that's in place. So I hope that we'll remember that, and we're going to hear some about that today. I really believe that this is about reconciliation in our community, where we've got folks that really want to speak to each other, that they have different positions, the community, the city employees, the hardworking employees, not only police and fire, but we need to come together as a community about this. And it's really about our quality of life. If you can take it beyond the pensions, well, what's happening to our libraries, what's happening to the rest of our quality of life if we don't get our fiscal house in order. And this is part of doing that. So it's really important for the community, and all of us want the best for the community. I've talked with city folks, I've talked with the pension fund trustees, one of them, and I've talked with the newspaper folks, and everybody wants the best for our community. So if we can remember that we're all in this together, I think that would be very helpful. So, we've got a very thorough agenda. We will be hearing from the pension fund trustee or their counsel at our next meeting. Their lawyer could not be here today, so they would prefer to come before the meeting. So we're going to start, well, actually we're going to start with the reminder of about the sunshine law and public records. I think everyone here has been on public work before. We are subject to the sunshine law. Just as an aside, the paper was filed, or Denton was filed suit about the sunshine law. We'll talk about the merits and demerits of that. But this is an opportunity for the whole community to hear what is before us, and so we should remember that. So, Ms. Lambert is going to tell us about sunshine law.
Good afternoon. My name is Alexis Lambert. I'm an attorney with the City of Jacksonville. I work in the communications office and help facilitate public records compliance for the city. I don't know any of you personally, but by reputation, from what I've read, it appears that all of you are rather civic-minded and have participated in different aspects of public life before, but I just wanted to keep everybody up to speed about your rights and your obligations under your public records law and under the public meetings law. For the attorneys in the room, we're talking about Chapter 119 of the Florida statutes and Chapter 286. For practical purposes, I would encourage all of you, as you receive email, some of you are receiving your email updates related to this board in your corporate email accounts. Some of you are receiving them in personal accounts. I would encourage all of you, for just organizational purposes and for the purposes of your own sanity, to take all of the emails you receive in connection with the transaction of this board and put them in a separate folder, so that when inevitably we receive public records requests for your correspondence related to this board, you are able to immediately grab them, stick them in a file, and just send them to me, because I will undoubtedly bug you at some point when someone asks for all of your correspondence. Gmail makes it really easy. Outlook makes it really easy. I have a little pension task force folder. It took me a grand total of about 30 seconds to create it today. And I would encourage you to do something similar to that, or whoever manages your email for you at your office. However you roll, do yourselves a favor and do that at your earliest convenience. Secondly, the great part about serving on a public board is that when these meetings are over, they're really over, because you're prohibited by law from discussing this business the second these meetings adjourn. And the public will make sure that you don't. Some of you know each other outside of these meetings, and that's a wonderful thing. You don't need to sever your relationships with one another outside of these meetings. You just can't talk about the business of these meetings outside of these meetings. Because if you do, you're subject to civil and criminal penalties under Florida law. But the Attorney General of Florida has long opined that even husbands and wives can serve on public boards together. They just can't discuss the business of those boards outside of properly noticed public meetings where minutes are taken. Anyone who's been in a relationship past a second date knows that there are plenty of things for people in interpersonal relationships to disagree about, so why would they discuss their service on a public board outside of the meetings of that public board? So we know not to discuss those things outside the context of a properly noticed public meeting where minutes are taken. This year at the legislative session, they passed a new aspect of Chapter 286 involving the right of the public to speak in public meetings. This was in reaction to some litigation that took place over the last couple of years. There is a new chapter of 286. It's Chapter 286.0114. It creates a statutory right of the public to speak in public meetings. Technically, it doesn't kick in until October 1st of 2013. However, given the inherent public interest in pension reform and the number of people in our community who have a very vested interest in pension reform and the ramifications on our community by it, we're going to allow public input at all of these meetings just because it's the right thing to do. We will have, give each member wishing to speak an equal amount of time and take minutes and all of that, but there is now a statutory right to speak. It kicks in a couple of months, and we want to make sure that members of the public feel that they're able to contribute at these meetings pursuant to the spirit of the law, as well as, tick-tock, the actual function of the law kicks in shortly. So, properly noticed public meetings where minutes are taken is where you do your talking. Make sure you organize your files so that they're easy to disclose. I'm really glad that I don't see any phones or iPads or anyone clicking or playing with your electronic devices at the table. That tends to really irritate members of the public participating in these meetings. actual members of the public who spoke in public hearings during the reapportionment process actually yelled at their legislators who were playing on their iPads during reapportionment. So just as a pro tip, don't do that. So thanks for not. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. This is literally my job. Other fun things that the Attorney General has actually had to issue opinions about. What's illegal under the Sunshine Law inside state boundaries of Florida is illegal if you go across the boundaries into Georgia or some other state. And the Sunshine Law is to be construed so as to frustrate all evasive devices. Not that you don't have better things to do with your time, but don't say I didn't tell you. Thank you very much for your service, and feel free to contact me if you need anything. If you want the written PowerPoint of the blow-by-blow breakdown of the Sunshine Law, I do have the PowerPoint that our Ethics and Compliance Officer created for your convenience.
Thank you. Well, let's get started. Mr. Hannon, you have the floor. Y'all can see from our breakdown, we've divided up the time, and we hope that we will be efficient in this. And I want to make sure we have some questions, that we have time for questions, but realizing that we have a very short time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, before I kind of give the overview of the agreement, and for all the speakers, by the way, I'm reminded we need to speak directly into the mic, so there's not the audio problems. As you said, Mr. Chairman, we are here under a legal posture, a lawsuit that was filed in federal court. So before I get into the overview, I want to have two members of our legal team come up and speak. One, Cindy Lacadera, to remind all the members of the committee the legal posture with which we are here today, the status of the litigation, and then Jim Lynn, who is not only our municipal pension counsel, but probably the most preeminent municipal pension counsel in the state of Florida, to give a brief overview of Florida public pension law, Mr. Chairman, to help frame up some of those legal issues you referred to at the start of the meeting. So with that, Ms. Lacadera.
Good afternoon. The federal litigation is in front of the Honorable E.R. Morales Howard. It was filed at the beginning of the year, and it has proceeded only to the pleading stage, meaning that there's been a complaint, an answer, a cross-claim, and an answer. So that litigation would take approximately 3 years or so. The last two cases I had in federal court took about 3 years to get through the district court level, 2 years on appeals if there are appeals. So what you're looking at is a case which I feel pretty strong about. I think ultimately we are going to win this case. And the question is when. So we'd win it in about 3 years, being aggressive. And then what we would get is a right to collectively bargain every 3 years. So by leaving the issue unresolved about whether I'm right or the Police and Fire Pension Fund attorney, Mr. Klossner, is right, we are able to provide some certainty to a government and let them do long-range planning. And that's really what we brought to the table, is so when you compare this deal, you're looking at a deal in which we leave that issue unresolved, and we continue as we have for the past since 1998, addressing issues of how the funds are deposited and managed in the trust fund with the trustees. We leave that in the trust. We leave it unresolved, whether under the particular factual scenario for this consolidated government, this is a collective bargaining issue. And we instead have a long-term agreement that allows the city to look forward in its finances. If we win this suit, or when we win this suit, as I'm fond of telling opposing counsel, we end up with the ability to come back and start collective bargaining negotiations with two separate unions, police and fire, and to negotiate a 3-year agreement. So when you come out and you look at the math, that's the analysis you should have. And if you think that risk and other matters aside, that you would get a better deal every 3 years and 3 years from now, and that it's worth that element of risk, then that would be the way you'd go. If you think that this deal has more certainty and that this would provide the government what it needs in terms of its financial constraints manner of moving forward, then you would endorse the settlement. And that's the analysis I provided to City Council. I'm a lawyer. I prefer to try cases. But I always bring in a complex case, the best settlement I can, to the clients to see whether they would prefer that settlement or they would prefer the litigation solution.
Any questions? Rick?
Yes, sir.
The chairman indicated in his opening remarks that his feeling was that we have a limited ability to affect current retirees or anybody who dropped already.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us whether you agree with that or not?
Yes, I do agree with that. And Mr. Lynn, who is the pension expert that I retained years ago, actually, Mr. Mullaney retained him first to advise us on pension because government pension is a unique and specialized area of law, is here and can answer those questions more specifically. But yes, once you're retired, you can't touch it. Once you have already accrued those benefits and earned those benefits, then you own them and they can't be taken away. So it's future benefits for existing employees that may be addressed.
Other questions? See, I got one. If the settlement were to go forward and some citizen felt that you should collectively mark, let's say an employee, could this be collaterally attacked by someone else down the road? Because you still have the issue unresolved about the enforcement.
Well, we have the issue unresolved because somebody filed a complaint, which you can do with a few $100s and the willingness to write anything down. But in terms of can it be collaterally attacked, the law doesn't provide that you can't take actions if you violated the Sunshine Act. It provides that you then take those actions again in the sunshine. So even if they were to prevail on what I think is a specious claim, then what you would do is you would have a meeting and you would say it in the public as, by the way, we're doing right now. So the law always provides a cure for sunshine. Other than that, you'd have to bind and gag an attorney and prevent you from taking action.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the lawsuit. You know, I'm talking about down the road, let's say 4 years from now, an employee says the agreement really isn't valid, and an employee set it all aside.
No. No. Anybody can always file a complaint, and we have 1,000 of them upstairs. We expect to win 999, I'm sure. But no, there can't be a collateral attack. In fact, that's why there's a waiver in writing. That's a right through the union. It gets worked out through the union, although the actions themselves constitute a waiver. So we're comfortable there's no collateral attack of this resolution if the council were to pass it. All right, Mr. Lynn's going to come up.
Mr. Chairman, I have maybe a little bit collateral question to that. If this were to be approved by City Council, it also has to be approved by the Police and Fire Pension Fund.
Yes.
Because it has to be approved by the union. The union is not, I don't think, live in the lawsuit itself.
Correct, they're not. And no, they would not be required to approve it. They've waived any, if they had a right to collectively bargain these issues, they've waived it both by their actions, which were physical, one of them infamously on YouTube, and the other we insisted on it in writing to prevent a collateral attack from the union afterwards. And so we have a written waiver of the collective bargaining agreements, because that's just a reasonable thing to do as the attorney. Look precisely as Mr. Shah had asked, who might collaterally attack this? And they could have switched their argument and said, no, we do have a right to collectively bargain this. And so we asked for the waiver in writing and would join them as Rule 19, which is called a necessary party, so that the court would be able to enforce the waiver.
Is that decision to waive that, is that a union vote or is that just a union leadership agreement?
That's a union leadership agreement. Just like in political bodies, you elect certain people, they have the powers, and they exercise them. The dispute then is internecine. It doesn't come outside the union. If someone felt that it had been improperly exercised, it's within the union to the union leadership. There's plenty of case law on that.
Also, answer your question. So the settlement agreement includes a waiver by the union over the right to collectively bargain on pension issues
Yes, it would be for the term of this agreement. And you have to recognize that there's a dispute back and forth over whether or not they have the right to begin with. And a good example on this is you compare FRS. FRS, the state legislature legislates those benefits. Those are collectively bargained by each of the school board unions, each of the county unions, sitting down and negotiating with their employer with a set pension. There's the pension, now I'm negotiating it by letting you argue the value of it in comparison to your wages. And so the question of whether you're collectively bargaining it is distinct from whether or not there's one that's going to be in place for a long time. And I think, again, the FRS is the best model on that.
The FRA is what?
FRS, I'm sorry, the Florida Retirement System.
Other questions?
Right, the Mr. Lynn will come up now briefly. Thank you.
I'm Jim Lynn from the law firm of Lewis, Longman and Walker, and I've been the city's special pension counsel for some years. I'm going to give you a 5-minute public pension law in a nutshell. First, we're talking about a defined benefit plan, which means that the benefits are based on a formula. So this is not like a 401k plan that many of you might be familiar with in the private sector. This is a plan where there's a formula to determine the benefits, and there's an employee contribution. There's some contributions from other sources, but the major source of funding for the benefit comes from the city, and the city is on the hook for making sure that the benefits are funded on a sound actuarial basis. That is in the Florida Constitution as well as in the statutes of the state. Basically, the private sector law, ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which governs all private pension plans, doesn't apply to governmental defined benefit plans. The state, 30 years ago, enacted its own version of ERISA in state law, and that's what sets the funding requirement. The state law says that if a city wants to establish one of these defined benefit plans, and there's about 500 of them in the state of Florida, that the city is responsible for funding the plan on a sound actuarial basis. What does that mean? It basically means that the plan benefits have to be paid for such that the cost of the current benefits, the benefits that are accruing now, as well as any to make up in it for any past benefits that weren't fully paid, that cost can't be shifted to future taxpayers. The legislature's requirement specifically is that the city has to pay that current cost, which is in actuarial parlance the normal cost, plus has to make a payment to amortize any unfunded liabilities, which is basically what's accrued in the past as a result of a lot of factors, but represents costs that weren't fully paid for in the past. And those unfundeds have to be paid off over a period of not more than 30 years. So a lot of focus in the last 2 or 3 years in Florida on exactly what cities, public employers can and can't do with respect to reforming pension plans. And we've now seen it play out at the state level. The Florida legislature 2 years ago made some significant changes to the Florida retirement system, and early this year the Florida Supreme Court upheld those changes by a resounding 4-3 vote. Basically you've had a little discussion here about what a public employer can and can't do. But the shorthand version is benefits that have already been earned. Well, first of all, start with the retirees. The case law makes very clear that any benefits that are payable to people who have already retired cannot be adversely affected, cannot be reduced. So the liabilities that are associated with the benefits that are payable, that have been promised to the retirees, those can't be touched. Drop participants, which, as you may know, many public pension plans in Florida have a drop, a deferred retirement option program, which allows employees to retire for purposes of the plan, but continue in employment for a period of time during which their pension benefit is frozen at the point that they entered the drop, and instead of the monthly benefit being paid to the employee directly, it's put into an account in the pension fund, and so at the point in the future, 3 years, 5 years down the line, that the employee leaves employment, he gets that same monthly benefit, but also he gets the lump sum value of those monthly benefits that have accrued during the drop period. Court decisions make clear that employees who have entered the drop are considered to be retired. So their benefits cannot be reduced. In addition to that, there's court decisions in this state that have held that employees who have reached retirement status under the plan, if the plan allows employees to retire after 25 years of service, an employee has reached 25 years of service but has not yet retired, they've reached retirement status, they could go out the next day, they could retire with their full benefit the next day, but they're still working. Courts have said that their pension benefits cannot be reduced. In addition, so that leaves the active employees.
Let me just interject. Does that mean that they can't be, or can they be required to contribute more as long as the retirees aren't?
Yeah, none of these people are contributing typically.
None of them.
Right. The active employees, the only category of those folks who might be contributing are the folks who have reached retirement status but haven't yet retired and not in the drop. That leaves essentially the only group of plan members that could be affected, could have their pension benefits legally reduced under the law in Florida, is the active employees who have not yet reached retirement status. I have taken the position, and I've advised clients all over Florida, that in my judgment, even though there's an argument to be made under certain cases that the benefits of active employees could be retroactively reduced. What do I mean by that? I mean an employee who has been earning a pension benefit under the formula of 3% per year, that employee, say after 15 years of service, gets told that no, we're going to change the plan and it's really only going to be 2% per year for those last 15 years that you thought it was 3%. I believe that the courts in Florida would not permit that retroactive reduction. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I'd be happy to go into more detail. I'm thinking that right now may not be the time to do that. But what I advise clients in terms of looking at pension reform and possibly reducing pension benefits is that The one clear area that the courts have said it is possible to reduce benefits is the future benefits that would be accrued by current employees going forward, not retroactive, going forward. And you're going to hear much more about the economics of that one category as it relates to this settlement agreement.
So let me just ask, when you talk about benefits, could the contributions required going forward?
The contributions can be increased prospectively. And so what you're going to hear, and I'm really winding up my part of this for now, is that there's really only a very small portion of the overall liabilities that we're talking about here that could be affected for the current employees. And with that, I'll leave it to questions you might have about the basics of the pension law and let Mr. Hand get on with his overview.
Questions? Let me just say that Dr. Rupp is here, he's sojourning in an airport unexpectedly, and he's got to have you join. John?
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. It's pretty much the point where I believe it goes to be, if you were to change prospectively the benefits of existing employees, does that change require any additional contributions to fully fund up or to get to a certain level of funding the unfunded liability, or can that change be made without it, irrespective of the status of the unfunded liability?
Well, I think I understand your question, and there's really not a connection. So the future benefits of the current employees could be reduced irrespective of the unfunded liability.
I have heard that if you make changes to the existing plan, you can only do that if you were in a mostly fully funded status. I didn't think that was true, but I want to make sure of that.
No, that's not
The funded
true.
status has nothing to do with the prospective change for existing.
It has something to do with it because the funded status is a reflection of the financial well-being of the plan, and obviously if benefits are adjusted, that's going to have an impact on the funded status, or could have an impact on the funded status.
Any other questions? I assume, Chris, or someone's going to tell us what those dollars are.
Absolutely.
John?
What portion of active employees are eligible employees
I think that's in the next section.
First, before we start, Mr. Wilbanks, could you repeat the question, just so we can go ahead and answer that now?
What about home?
Oh, sure.
Kim?
So, just want to take your point and go a little bit off the reservation about that. And so one of the things that's been mentioned to me is that, well, why don't we just pay the plan out? Let's just cut it off, pay the plan out now. I think what you just said is if we do that, that doesn't change the liability that the city has for current retirees or retirees.
That's exactly correct. The city is on the hook for those unfunded liabilities, whether the plan is closed, frozen, terminated, whether all the employees are contracted out to other employers, the city still is liable for those unfunded liabilities. Now, you've mentioned, getting rid of the plan, and that's, in my understanding, that's a plan termination. And at some point, I'd be happy to go into more detail about why it's simply not practical under Florida law to terminate a plan like this that has significant unfunded liabilities. The bottom line is that the pension board by law is in charge. If the plan is terminated, the pension board becomes responsible for deciding how the benefits are going to be paid out. And we have a couple of examples of other cities where plans have been terminated, and it has turned into a much more expensive, in other words, the pension board selected a method of paying benefits that added to the liabilities of the plan. And so in the most recent case that I'm aware of, effectively the board's decision to purchase annuities for the employees doubled the liabilities in this current economic climate.
Any other?
I just want to clarify, you mentioned that the pension benefits under those 4 scenarios where they reach the retirement age, they're still contributing, they're still working. If there were an increase in the contribution percentage, they would be frozen at the previous percentage, is that correct?
You know, that's a great question, and the courts really haven't addressed whether their contribution could be increased or not. The court decisions have focused on whether the benefits could be reduced. So I can't answer that.
I maybe misunderstood the question. I thought you said they could be reduced or increased going forward.
She would, now, we're talking two different things.
Okay.
She was talking about the group of people who are still working but have reached retirement status. And the case law says those people's benefits cannot be reduced. Her question was, what about their contributions increased? And I think that's an open question.
I thought earlier you said they're not contributing after they reach drop status.
Okay, two different categories. The drop people are not contributing. The people but there is a different category of persons who, for whatever reason, get to the normal retirement age, don't go into the drop, but continue to work. Those people would still be contributing.
Okay, thank you.
So before I begin, Mr. Wilbanks, did you have a? Okay, be happy to do that. Well, wanted to provide a bit of an overview on the agreement itself and some of the different aspects of it. And just to kind of give you a heads up, I'll speak, then Mr. Grivey, who's our city treasurer, and Robert Dazubi, who's the city's actuary, will kind of drill down on some of the financial questions. And then Ms. Lackadair and Mr. Lynn will be back up to answer any outstanding legal questions that exist, just so we've given you a full presentation. So let me start on this overview. Okay, one thing I would say is if you don't remember anything else today, we hope you'll remember 8 key points about the retirement reform agreement. The first is the overall level of savings. The agreement that we've reached with public safety would create $1.2 billion in savings over a 30-year period. Now, just by way of comparison, the plan that was considered at the end of the last administration, which is 2011-400, that was projected to save $700 million over 35 years. Laid a great foundation, and I'll talk more in a second about the important work that Mayor Payton and his team did. But you can see, sort of comparatively speaking, what this produces in terms of additional savings. Now, those are not just numbers we've pulled out of thin air. They've numbers that have been confirmed by 2 separate pension actuaries. One is someone you'll hear from momentarily, Robert Dazubi of the Milliman Group, who is the city's pension actuary, and Jarman Welch, who's the actuary for the Police and Fire Pension Fund. He's with a company called Pension Board Consultants. You've seen that in your materials as well. So not only has Mr. Dazubi confirmed that number, but so has Jarman Welch from Pension Board Consultants. So that's key point number 1. Key point number 2 to keep in mind is that the reforms in this agreement are actually more significant than reforms in the Florida retirement system. These reforms go beyond those. And the reason that is a relevant basis of comparison is, as you may know, 65 of 67 counties in the state have their special risk police and fire employees in the Florida retirement system. So when you match up what this would do as opposed to what the Florida retirement system would do, you see some very significant differences in the significance of these reforms. So for example, under the Florida retirement system, the vesting is 8 years. The city of Jacksonville would go to 10 years. Years to retirement would be the same, 30 years for each. Their benefit accrual rate would be 3%, ours would be 2.5%. Their employee contribution, 3%, the city's would be 10%, so a very significant difference there. Under their plan for new employees, drop is maintained, drop which Mr. Lynn referred to. Under the city's plan, it would be abolished. And when you look at all those, and then you add in the fact that under the Florida retirement system, the state provides Social Security to its employees, and the city of Jacksonville does not. So that gives you some flavor of the significance of these benefit changes going forward over the life of the agreement. Okay, another key point that you've heard a lot about is the rate of return. And there's been concern over the years, both in Florida, other places, and the municipalities throughout Florida, that the state, municipalities and others use an unrealistically high rate of return. Of course, that's never been more poignant, that feeling, than sort of during the current economic troubles, when none of us have been earning on our investments what we'd like to. So you can see where this agreement takes the rate of return for the police and fire pension fund. Just 2 years ago, the rate of return was 8.5%. Under this agreement, it will be 7.75 for each of the next 2 fiscal years. Will drop to 7.5% for the 3rd year, and then in the final year would establish at a new baseline of 7.25%. Now, when Mr. DeZubi and Mr. Grivey get up here, you'll hear them talk about how that stair-step reduction is the best practice in reducing rates of return, and one that's very commonly used across different pension plans. Now, just by way of comparison, not using this as a baseline, but just by way of comparison, the Florida retirement system's rate of return is 7.75%. So when we get to 2016, our baseline will be 50 basis points below what the Florida retirement system is. And if you compare, compare this to an average of 491 pension plans in the state, local Florida plans in the state of Florida, their average rate of return is 7.69%. So Jacksonville, if this agreement is adopted, will be a real leader in lowering that rate of return to make it as realistic as possible. And of course, don't forget that one of the reasons to have that realistic rate of return is every point, every dollar we earn more than the rate of return is a dollar that accrues to the benefit of the plan, meaning that the unfunded liability decreases and the city's contribution to the plan decreases as well. So setting it at a realistic level and then changing the governance structure of the police and fire pension fund so it is designed and geared to exceed that rate of return was a key aspect of this agreement. Okay, another key sort of immediate fiscal issue, and that's the question as to whether this year's deficit or this coming year's deficit is $64 million or $19 million. Now, the city each year presents actually budgets at 2 different times. It first presents a preliminary budget approximately a month or 2 before the final budget, and on Monday of next week, Mr. Anderson can't wait, the city will present the mayor will present his final budget to the city council. That's due on July 15th of every year. Now, this year at the request of council, we presented actually 2 preliminary budgets. One that incorporated the savings with retirement reform, one that did not. So just to kind of give you a sense of what that difference looks like. Without retirement reform, in other words, the state of the law right now, because nothing's been adopted, our public safety pension contribution for next year is $148 million. As a result of this agreement, if it were to be adopted, our contribution for the next fiscal year would be $103 million. And the difference, obviously, is $45 million. And I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of what $45 million means in real city budgeting terms. So, not at all, please.
You mentioned as part of the agreement, we would keep the rate of return 7 3/4.
Correct.
Okay, and what is the current rate that has been just recently approved by?
7.0 is the.
Tell me the amount of savings that those 2 numbers generate.
And when you say those 2 numbers, do you mean the difference between those 2? It's approximately $26 million. Sure, let me see if I can repeat the question and answer at the same time. I think what Chairman Anderson is asking is, what's the savings for next year is $45 million. I believe he's asking how much of that savings is due to the fact that the rate of return would be 7.75% as opposed to 7.0%. Is that what you're asking? Yes. And the answer would be approximately $26 million. questions there? Okay.
In other words, you don't have to contribute $26 million.
That's correct, yeah, by maintaining it at 7.75%.
I got a follow-up question to that, and I've given some thought to that. I'm not sure the rate of return really matters. The only thing the rate of return does is assist you in the calculation of what your current year's pension contribution is. Ultimately, what the city is obligated to do is to contribute sufficient monies, along with earnings and the monies they previously contributed, to pay out the benefits. This calculation is used as an assumption to say, we will earn this money over a period of time. If we set this at 7%, but the fund actually earns 10%, the future city's contribution will be reduced. If you set this at 9%, and the city, and it earned 12%, the future contributions will still be reduced. Ultimately, what the fund actually earned is going to determine totally what the city's contribution obligation is over time. Is that correct?
I believe you're stating that correctly. There may be people who want to jump in legally or financially, but I think you've correctly articulated that.
So at the end of the day, it's what the actual return is. But if you're using that as an estimate, what you contribute each year is somehow within it, but you're right, the actual.
And so state law requires you to have financially sound contributions to the plan. And so this needs to be financially sound and a realistic rate of return, so you do put the proper amount away, but ultimately what you have to contribute depends on what the fund actually earns.
True, and I know Ms. Lagdare wants to add something, but I will also say there has to be a process each year by which the city's given a bill. Here's the amount you owe, and that's the process that's set up through the city ordinance code, where the Police and Fire Pension Fund Board issues that invoice, so to speak, that the city has to pay, taking into account some of the factors you're talking about, Mr. Appleby. Cindy, do you want?
Yes, Mr. Appleby and to the other members, the issue here in terms of the negotiation was who would control the reasonableness of that rate for the next 5 years. And so it was an issue not so much of doing the math down the road, because you're entirely right, it'll earn what it earns, but to allow the city to plan each year for the next few years on the budget and going forward. So it's just an issue of control, because other than that, it is a reasonableness criteria, and reasonableness has a range. And so that control would be with the Police and Fire Pension Fund as opposed to with the City Council. That was the issue.
Mr. Wilbanks.
Is there a schedule that has the actual return?
We can certainly provide, or we can provide what it's been historically, yes, sir. And I tell you, I'll defer that question to Mr. Grivey and Mr. DeZubi when they get up, if I could. No, that's great. These are important financial questions. Let me say one thing about the rate of return and sort of what's in the agreement as well. In addition to lowering it to a baseline of 7.25%, basically 3 years from now, it also provides some regulation of how that rate can be raised or lowered in future years. To put it as candidly as possible, to some extent, the city is at the mercy of the Police and Fire Pension Fund Board of Trustees in terms of where that rate is set. While there are tools the city can use to challenge a rate of return that they have adopted, it involves our actuary weighing in, a third-party actuary weighing in. It's not an easy thing to change. One of the long-term benefits we've tried to put into this agreement is, in addition to lowering it to a 7.25% rate, what it also does for the term of the agreement is limit the ability of the Police and Fire Pension Fund to raise or lower that actuarial rate of return in future years to 25 basis points per year. And the reason that's important is you don't want the Police and Fire Pension Fund raising it artificially high, which creates some of the problems that Mr. Appleby alluded to, or dropping it too low, which creates budget problems for the city. So this was not just a several-year snapshot. We tried to look throughout the entire term of the agreement to make sure that we had stability and weren't subject to massive increases or massive decreases, both of which can have either an unrealistic effect on the city's contribution or a financially destabilizing effect on the city's contribution. So that's an important point I wanted to make sure.
How do you determine, we have the option to apply the increase in earnings, if we got greater returns to the unfunded liability versus in invested money?
Well, and again, I'll have our financial people address that specifically, Dr. Akins, but the answer is yes. To any point in which you are earning more than the plan is projected to earn, that both lowers the unfunded liability and lowers the city's contribution because those two factors are connected. Right now, the amount we pay each year consists of two components. Our normal cost, in other words, how much are we paying in each year just to fund the pension benefit for employees? But quite frankly, the bulk of our payment each year is essentially our, what I'll call a debt payment on that unfunded liability. So to the extent that unfunded liability is lower, so is our debt payment, so is our contribution to the plan each year. So the answer is yes, they're connected, and any rate of return that comes in better than the assumed rate lowers the rate of return, and thus, as a result, lowers our contribution.
And I think you've answered it. I was interested in the process by which that we certify the rate of return and how much leverage our government has over that rate of return. And what I heard you say was that it's really the pension board, our pension board, and that we don't have any ability to affect that.
Well, I'll say it a little bit differently. There's not a certification process so much as there is a process by which the city could challenge that rate of return. However, the way that process works, and it's enshrined in our ordinance code, is the city actuary would have to declare that police and fire pension fund rate of return to be unreasonable, and then the two parties would select a third actuary, a tiebreaker actuary, so to speak, who would then say kind of who was right and who was wrong. So there's a challenge process. I will tell you, and Mr. DeZubi can certainly elaborate on this when he gets up as the city's actuary, that would not be, say, an option we would likely be able to use this time, as I think it's his opinion that that 7.0 rate falls within the range of reasonable. And so there's not so much a certification process as there is an ability to challenge it. That's also, again, as I alluded to a minute ago, why we wanted to sort of build in a sort of a regulator, a governor, so to speak, as to how the police and fire pension fund could change that rate of return, just so the city had some stability over time.
And that's a cumulative rate on 25 basis points from the stated rate.
That's not a cumulative rate. That's the most that in any given year that they can raise it. So it's a 25% up or down in any particular year. Now, under the state law, the police and fire pension fund is only required to do an actuarial valuation study every 3 years. So the next one would be essentially 3 years hence. So they do that study. There's a pension contribution that is typically dialed in for the next 3 years. They do another study, and there's another one. So that's something that would probably happen if they do it consistent with state law, as opposed to a more frequent valuation of the plan that would happen every 3 years.
I think I'm the slowest in the room, and I'm still going back. Where did the 7% come from? Because I've got 8.5 and I've got 7. Because you first mentioned it.
Sure, and sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me clarify that. The 7% is back in March of this year. The Police and Fire Pension Fund tentatively adopted a new rate of return of 7.0%. Okay, they have formally adopted that now as of about 10 days ago, at the end of June. Now that formal adoption of that 7.0 rate is subject to the status of this agreement. So if the agreement passes and the board, FPFPF board passes it, then the rate would be according to this schedule that I've got on the slide.
So that if this isn't agreed to or approved, then the rate goes to 7%. And that's your question, is that would mean a $26 million increase in the city.
Correct.
Now,
Correct. Yes, sir.
other
Okay.
questions?
Okay. So getting back into budgeting, I talked about that $45 million difference, and I wanted to just sort of give people a sense of what $45 million means in real city budget terms. $45 million, if you use an average compensation, salary plus benefits of about $60,000, $45 million equals the jobs of 750 city employees. It's more than double the budget of the current budget, this year's budget, of the Department of Parks and Recreation, and it's roughly equal to the combined current budgets for public libraries and neighborhoods. Now, as we previously described, we submitted 2 preliminary budgets at Council's request, and we'll submit a final budget on Monday. And while we're still working and kind of putting the finishing details on that, some of that has already kind of come out in terms of what the departmental budget reductions, suggested budget reductions have been. And I'll just sort of remind you what some of those have been to help close that $45 million gap. So, for example, the Jacksonville Public Library Board has recommended reducing hours sort of system-wide and closing 6 branch libraries. The Jacksonville Fire Rescue Division has recommended closing fire stations and taking fire equipment out of service in other stations. And then the Parks and Recreation Department has recommended closing approximately 72% of its community centers. Those are the types of cuts you're going to see in the budget, because right now retirement reform hasn't passed, so we have to use that $148 million number by law. Again, you've probably seen some news treatment of that, but those are some of the types of cuts that are having to be made at this point and that will be in the budget on Monday.
Chris, in the documents referring to those 2 budgets were included. And on the revenue side, my recollection is that in neither of those, is the millage rate relates to property values more than all proposed to be the millage rate the same.
Correct.
And so that reduces it. I think the number was $8 million. Because you've chosen not to raise the millage rate to keep the revenues exactly the same as they were this year.
You're referring, Mr.
About $8 million.
Sure, and there will be updated estimates in the July 15th budget. That's something that they, up until the day of, they're constantly recalculating to see what the ad valorem taxes will bring in, what other revenue sources will bring in. So it may look a little bit different than it was in the preliminary budget, but not dramatically so. What you're referring to is the difference between the sort of keeping the millage rate absolutely flat, which is what we're going to propose. Mayor Brown has made it very clear he's not going to propose any tax increases, and using what's called the roll-up rate. The roll-up rate being setting the tax rate at the amount required to have the same amount of revenue as the previous year. The difference
So that's
between...
a policy decision.
Correct.
The council will ultimately decide.
Correct. Okay. Sort of our next key point, and this is very current, and we sent this out to members of the committee and others today. Retirement reform, or not achieving retirement reform, we've been now told by a ratings agency, is a risk to the city's credit rating. As you probably saw, yesterday the Fitch ratings agency released a report related to the city's special revenue bonds, and they, in that report, described the city's current pension liability as, quote, a key credit concern and a threat to credit quality. It also described the tentative agreement as a positive that is expected to stabilize the city's pension burden over the long term. And perhaps most ominously, the report notes that, quote, a delay in implementing reforms could pressure the city's rating. Obviously, a matter of great concern, because that obviously also has budgetary implications. We just did in the city a major debt refinancing earlier this year. There's a big push on the part of the administration and the part of City Council to try and boost. Among many of our bonds, we're at a AA+ rating. There's an effort being made to try and make us a AAA city. Not passing retirement reform, we're concerned, could put that at risk, and we've now got some feedback, public feedback from one of the ratings agencies that that is a realistic concern. Okay, this is something that Mr. Lynn already addressed, but I'll just sort of go over it again. As he said, another key point, there are legal restrictions on the changes we can make. By law, we can't change benefits for any city employees who are already retired or who are eligible for retirement. He used the example of someone who'd worked 25 years. Our current normal retirement for public safety employees here is 20 years. So someone who had crossed that 20-year threshold but had not yet retired would be subject to these legal restrictions. And of course, we can't take away benefits, as Mr. Lynn said, that current non-retired employees have already accrued. The other point, and I know Ms. Lackadair and Mr. Lynn will address this when they get back up here on some of the other legal issues, if the federal court, and as Ms. Lackadair said, we believe the city's right in that, but as a former litigator myself, I can tell you that litigation is always uncertain. If the federal court were to uphold the so-called 30-year agreement, if they were to say to the public safety officers who filed it, you know what, you're right, the city's engaged in these contracts with you, and therefore they are stopped from now trying to get out of those contracts. If they were to prevail, we could not address benefit changes except with the permission and the agreement of the other side until to the year 2030. So that's another potential contractual legal restriction that exists in this particular matter. Okay. Another sort of question that's come up, also sort of related to the agreement, but also on the legal point, is why is this agreement valid for 17 years? I've heard that from a number of people. Boy, that sure seems like a long time. Why are you sort of bound for that period of time? Again, keep in mind that that's not a date that we just sort of pulled out of thin air and decided that'd make a good time to make the agreement terminate. The terminus of this proposed agreement is September 30th, 2030. That is the same terminus of what is today thought of as the 30-year agreement, the one that is currently governing what our police and fire pension benefits are. One of the differences is, while we're under the same term, we, of course, as I've explained earlier, make very, very significant benefit changes that would last over that 17-year term. So this agreement corresponds with the term of the current agreement that exists, but makes and solidifies those major benefit changes over that 17-year period. It also provides, having a longer period of time, certainty both for the city and for city employees. And as Ms. Alcadera pointed out, like with the Florida retirement system, it helps to focus future negotiations on things that are quite frankly easier to negotiate, wages and working conditions, providing a set pension and saying you can sort of adjust your negotiations on those other issues around what the pension is.
Let me just say, I asked Mrs. Lafleur about that, the 17 years and whether the city might be willing to reduce it. And it's would you explain what, I don't want to put words in your mouth, because that, it seemed to me that you could be negotiating more, you have more flexibility, but she had, I want the committee to hear at least her position, which I think is the same.
There were two negotiation points. One is to, I thought it was to an advantage and strove to bring to the client, the city, the long-term certainty, because it has a value in the market. The second aspect of it is they're about as low as you're going to get for those 30 years. The city has what we call 218 letters so that we don't have to pay Social Security. If you look at the cost per employee of this going forward, it's roughly equivalent to Social Security plus the contribution from the state that comes in. And so if we didn't have this, you can't get lower than the Social Security cost. And so those two things, maybe want to bring it out as long as possible. And it equates to about 6.5% of employee cost plus a 4% contribution from the 175, 185 chapter. So those two things, financial certainty going in the future, and the cost of it, looking at it and thinking, I don't think if I have to go back and negotiate every 3 years, that my average is going to get this low. Thank you.
It's probably more Chris's point, but it may be. The 17-year term of the agreement, the existing agreement, if it's valid, where the union has selected the pension fund as its agent for negotiating benefits, that through the years, when benefits were changed in the past, it was the city and the pension fund sitting down and agreeing to that. So within that 17 years, you could still have changes as long as it was mutually negotiated and agreeable between the city and the pension fund under this agreement.
Just like any contract, if both parties consent to sitting down and changing a contract, they can modify it. Okay, any other questions about that piece? So just sort of for the last key point before I get into some of the nuts and bolts on the agreement, just wanted to outline and make sure you were clear on some of the key risks of disapproval. We don't approve this. We've already sort of discussed the fact that there'll have to be $45 million in cuts in this year's budget. That number is $27 million for the following year's budget and potential cuts to services. Mr. Gravy and Mr. Giuseppe will talk about this, but over the next 5 years, the city will pay approximately an additional $100 million in pension contributions without the agreement. As I've described, there's a risk to the city's credit rating, and a couple other are more intangible, but I think also very important to keep in mind. If we don't sort of adopt this agreement, we could face years of, as I said, uncertain litigation that will cost taxpayers millions of dollars. Obviously, this kind of complex litigation is expensive, lengthy. This could go from the Federal District Court up to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, over to the Florida Supreme Court. It'll be like a game of pinball. Could take quite some time to get resolution. And of course, where you end up at the end of that resolution, as Ms. Lacadera said, is you end up with the right to negotiate afresh with the unions in the collective bargaining process. So it's a lot of work to get back to the beginning after several years of this process. I think the other risk, and maybe the most profound one, the least tangible, maybe the most profound, is that not passing this is losing an opportunity for major reform. As you know, this issue has lingered. It's been unresolved. The lack of resolutions had an impact on city finances, had an impact on the public safety departments, their ability to recruit, retain, morale. The longer this issue sits out there, the more difficult it becomes for the city to manage those pension issues. So just in terms of what I think you're always doing a benefit risk calculation in everything we do, those are some of the major risks of not moving forward on pension reform. So with that, let me just give you a brief sense, a little bit of an overview of the problem and of this agreement. First, just to give you a historical sense of kind of why we're here. If you look at the chart on page 14 of the PowerPoint presentation, you see how the city's police and fire pension fund contributions have grown very significantly over about the last decade. Approximately 10 years ago, our contribution to the police and fire pension fund was just under $10 million a year. This year's budget, it's $123.1 million. Again, without reform, that'll jump to $148 million in next year's budget. So, assuming reform were not adopted, you'd be going from, again, over basically an 11-year period, from $9.7 million to $148 million. Just the amount we've gotten to this year is an increase of 1,125% over the past decade. That's obviously a massive increase in how much the city is paying toward the police and fire pensions each year.
A question on that, Chris. Yeah. I don't know if you can have this or not. Obviously, if you look at that, your first reaction is, oh my gosh, what's happening? But do you have a if you started with a $10 million, $9.7 million in 2002, 2003, and now we're $121 million, that increase is really driven by probably several significant factors. One was the investment performance, the downturn stock market, the increase in the number of participants in the plan because the increase in the size of the police and fire department, and therefore you have a larger payroll. And then there were changes in benefits about 2001, 2002. But there have not been any significant, I don't think, or have there been any significant changes in benefits since some time period that has caused that to be driven up, or those changes been a long time?
Mr. Epley, I think you've identified all the key factors, although I will tell you the size, and the sheriff and the fire chief can speak better to this than I can, the size of the labor force, maybe the amount just because of pay going up over time, the amount of payroll has increased. I don't think the size of the labor force over that time has dramatically increased. But you've identified some of the other key factors as well. The plan, particularly during the economic crisis, underperforming, earning less than the assumed rate of return, but also the increase in benefits. We've provided you in your packet today the so-called 30-year agreement, which was passed in 2001, and some subsequent amendments to it. We'll go back and give you the agreements from 1991 to the present. Because one of the things you'll see in there is over that period of time, a steady increase in benefit enhancements, benefit additions. A COLA was added at some point. Then a certain percentage of COLA was guaranteed. The drop program was added. So it's a combination of an expanded, enhanced benefit package and a sort of lower than hoped for return on investments in the plan.
But those weren't changing. If you look at 2010, 2011, 75 million and jumping to 121.
True.
There really weren't any changes in the benefit package.
Right.
In the recent years. That really does benefit package is a major driver along with investment return.
Sure. Well, and one other factor I'll mention as well, particularly in these latter years, Mr. Appleby, some of the changes are related to the police and fire pension fund reducing the assumed rate of return. So for example, 2 years ago, the rate of return was 8.5%. As Mr. DeZubi can speak to more, because he also happens to be the actuary for the Florida retirement system, the state told the police and fire pension fund, you've got to reduce your rate of return. So that's been reduced in 2 pretty big steps. Right now, again, it's down to 7.0, but was reduced from 8.5 to 7.75%. That accounts for that big jump between fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2013.
Is there a calculation that says from the $10 million contribution required in 2002, 2003 to $121 million was driven, that difference, $110 million, was caused by X amount investment return, X amount change in benefits? Has somebody actually done that calculation to see what growth is?
That's probably a better question for Mr. Grivey and Mr. DeZubi. I don't have that calculation, but you should certainly ask them that when they're up there. So. Questions? Okay. Another sort of metric that I think is important to see is the sort of the underfunding of the plan. In October 2003, the plan had an unfunded liability of just over $400 million. As of October 2011, which was sort of the date and time that the last evaluation study was done, that unfunded liability was just under $1.4 billion. So you can see, again, over about an 8-year period, for, again, due to some of the factors that Mr. Appleby's discussed, you saw an increase of approximately $1 billion in the unfunded liability of the Police and Fire Pension Fund. And just to give you a little bit more recent snapshot, the Police and Fire Pension Fund uses, like any pension plan does, has investment consultants, in this case Summit Strategies. In December of 2012, they released a report that concluded the following, that as of October 1st, 2011, the Police and Fire Pension Fund was only 38% funded, that it would not exceed 50% funding until another decade had passed, and its recommended remedies were modifying benefits, increasing contributions, and increasing investment returns. And those 3 are important because you're going to see those 3 themes in the agreement that's been reached here. And by the way, I believe that report is in your materials that you've got.
Well, let me just say, I'm just looking at my watch.
Sure.
I think we have seen most of these in the packages that were
Sure.
distributed to us. So I think in the interest of time, I mean, I'm looking through here because I think it'd be helpful to hear from Mr. Kazuki
Sure.
and others. Is that fair to say that y'all have these in ahead of time?
And let me just also say, in the interest of time, we are more than happy to, if you have particular questions about the benefit changes, what we've tried to do in there is give you a sort of snapshot of what the current package has, what the last legislation on this, 2011-400, provided, and what this reform plan provides as well, to give you that basis of comparison. And again, as you look through that, we are more than happy to sort of provide that additional information.
I did want a visual update on slide 24, so you can read that.
Sure.
But it's talking about the current lawsuit, union as against the city, that this process violated the sunshine laws. And of course, that's a big concern. And would you or Cindy have some comment about that and when we can expect final resolution?
Sure, and I'll tee it up, and when she gets up to talk about the legal piece, she can do more. Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to real quickly just go over this and one other slide, and then turn over to Mr. Grivey, Mr. DeZubi. That's one of the sort of myths that's out there, Chairman Anderson, is that the city and the unions engaged in secret collective bargaining in violation of the Sunshine Law. Obviously, the city takes a very different position and has filed a motion to dismiss that complaint that was filed against the city. Our position is the unions waived collective bargaining, both in their actions, the FOP getting up and walking away from the table, the firefighters also declining to negotiate pension benefits, and in writing. And also very important to remember is this proposed retirement reform agreement, because it is not final, it does not become final until City Council says it becomes final, still has to go through the open City Council process to become law. So for example, as you know, Mr. Chairman, on June 27th, we had a meeting of the Finance Committee, open meeting where we gave a presentation similar to this. You asked questions. There was public comment. Ms. Lackadair can speak to better what the next stages in that lawsuit are, but the city has filed, and the Police and Fire Pension Fund have filed a motion to dismiss in that case. So,
And I think Greg's interest really is acting as a member of the city council, really for this committee. Cindy, what's the best guess of when that's going to get resolved? So that you can, I think that's really what you're asking.
I'm not certain when the courts will hear it because they've also filed, this is a federal court order and there's a collateral attack in state court. It's a great law school problem. I'm enjoying responding, but I guess the best place to put is if there is a Sunshine Act violation, this law is very clear, then what you do is you convene a notice meeting and you go through the motions again in the sunshine. So, I don't know how many times we have to talk about this in public. I'm already waking up in the middle of the night doing it. But we would just notice it. If the courts hadn't ruled by then, we would just notice it as simultaneous with the city council meeting. We're discussing it would be done. It's an issue full well known by the opposition. So there just isn't any risk.
The existing case law would be that you cure the sunshine, you're permitted to cure a sunshine violation by having sunshine be. That's what I
Correct.
understand.
That's correct. So even if there were one, which there absolutely is not, there's a contract dispute, we mediated it like I mediate 50 cases a year, but even if there were one, then the way to do it is not to prevent the city council from taking action on a pension plan, not to gag me on a prior restraint and not have me speak, but instead just to notice the meeting simultaneously, have the union reps attend the meeting, and then the city council goes about its business. So it's all quite silly, actually.
Any questions from you?
And I'm sorry, I'm not going to blame you.
Yes.
I know you're getting tired of answering the same question.
That's all right.
Yeah, so if the township knows that, why are they, I don't understand.
No, I don't either, and that's why there's
Is it such an easy solution, anybody within?
it's political. I mean, let's leave it at that. You can read the documents were filed, you can read the motions were filed, and that's where we are. So I prefer not to discuss stuff I'm on blood pressure medicine already, but we'll just leave it that this is an issue well controlled, and the city council is entitled to consider any settlement that's get put in front of them, and they will.
Any other questions related to
and I'm going to segue to Mr. Gravy and Mr. DeZubi, but I'm sorry.
I do have one question.
Sure.
On T-25, I know that it was just received yesterday regarding the city's pension, but can you understand, or can we quantify to what level of concern we have about that impact would be?
That's a perfect question that Mr. Gravy and Mr. DeZubi will answer momentarily as soon as I pull them up. So excellent timing on that question. The one thing I just want to say to sort of tee them up, just get started, is one of the biggest myths that exists out there is that the agreement would have saved much more had it made major changes for current employees. And I just want to, they're going to talk about this in more detail, but I think it's really important we drill down on that point today because that's been a subject of great public debate. And one key statistic to sort of keep in mind, and they'll address this more, of the police and fire pension funds, $2.4 billion in actuarial liability, and that's just both the funded and the unfunded liability, 90% of it, or $2.2 billion, is tied up in benefit commitments either to current retirees or current employees who are already retirement eligible, or related to those benefits for current employees that we can't change because they've already accrued them. That leaves about $200 million in liability. And if you, for example, were to exempt employees with less than 10 years to retirement, just as a matter of fundamental fairness, that $200 million, or the ability to affect that, decreases even further. And as Mr. Lynn agreed to earlier, the remaining liability could only be eliminated outright if we were to abolish sort of retirement altogether, which is not possible legally or practically. So I want to have Mr. Gravy and Mr. Zuby come up now because they're going to really get into even some deeper nuts and bolts on those numbers related to the overall plan, but also related to that issue about current employees, because that's been a major sticking point in some of the public discussion, and they can really drill down and help you get to the granular level on that. So thank you for your time, and we'll be here to answer questions. And if you need for your PowerPoint. Sure.
Good afternoon, Joey Gravy, City Treasurer. Thanks for taking the time to let us talk to you today about the merits of the pension proposal that's on the table right now. I've got a few handouts. Carol, would you mind helping pass these out. This was not part of the packet that you received in the mail. I just worked on some of this morning to help drive this home. But just want to go through a presentation. Some of this may be redundant to some of what Chris talked about, some of what Cindy talked about, and Jim Lynn. And with one of the preeminent, as Chris said, pension actuaries in the state and arguably the country here with us today, I may often defer to him today. You can hear from me anytime. I'm on the 3rd floor of City Hall, so while we've got him here, I may kick him over to him. But let's just start through here. Once they all get passed out, I don't think you can see what I can see here. Okay, being that some of this is redundant, and I see that it's starting to make its way down the aisle there, I'll get going. What I want to do is point out just a few of the things that we've been hearing over the last several weeks, if not month, since we released some of the financial details prepared by Mr. DeZubi. I presented a cover memo, which you have likely read. It was in the packet that you had provided to you. Key point number one, if reform fails, next year pension contributions will be $181 million instead of the $136 million. You may have heard Chris talk about $148 million. That is public safety only. What I have done in the 5-year analysis that I provided to you is I've included the general fund component of the general employees pension plan and the correctional officers plan as well, just to give you a more full view of what kind of a pension situation we are in now. I believe it was either Kirsten or Kelly that brought up the Fitch report, and we'll talk about that too. That's in the packet that I just distributed to you. That's hot off the press. That came out yesterday afternoon. It's in connection with a refinancing deal. Very small portion of new money to finance the Godbold purchase, but the majority is refinancing. Anytime we do an issue on a bond, we talk to Fitch, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's, and they release an update on the overall outlook of the city's finances and of the credit lien specific to what we were refinancing at the time or issuing on at the time. What Fitch concluded is that pension is a big issue. That's nothing new to us. We've been hearing from them over the last couple of years. I joined the city about 3 years ago, right at the tail end of the previous administration, and that's been a consistent message that, hey, you need to get your pension under control because it's one of the only things that we see that could threaten your credit going forward. Overall, if you read the memo from Fitch, it talks about consistent, strong financial management. We've added to reserves for the past 7 years in a row. Overall, a lot of positive comments, but the one negative was any delay, I probably am not quoting them perfectly, but any delay in the adoption of pension reform would cause them to rethink the rating which they've assigned to us, which is AA on the revenue that we were refinancing and pledging against the current deal, and the AA plus that we maintain, and they reaffirmed yesterday on the city's ultimate general obligation bonds. So I hope that answers your question. Kelly, did you have any? Okay. So Chris mentioned briefly, and you'll see it in the presentation I gave you on the one-pager on the 5-year forecast, about $100 million more in increased pension contributions over the 5 years if this doesn't go through. That's obviously one of the key factors that they're looking at. I think in their report, they run things a little differently, and we don't really question them in the way that they analyze things. I think their number came in more in the $93 to $95 million number, but that's within rounding error, and that's just the difference of how the two are looking at the numbers. But either way, it's a big deal for us to get this done. And I mentioned that the city credit rating will be reconsidered. If this doesn't go through, like Chris talked about, we may have missed out on a great opportunity on landmark pension reform, major pension reform. And we would remain committed to paying the current system of benefits that are in place right now, and there would be no changes until it gets litigated and ultimately we decide who we were supposed to negotiate with, if that's the ultimate issue, which Cindy can talk more about, and then what deal do you end up with? Is it better than this or is it not better than this? That's what the decision before us would be at that time. One of the main things that Chris talked about is why didn't we get more from current employees, and Robert can talk to this very well, probably much better than me. I've highlighted some of the key points here. The fact that we did get some from current employees, we didn't walk away with nothing. That point hasn't been made clear enough in some of what I've seen and heard. About $20 million was transferred from an enhanced benefit account reserve into base benefits to help pay for the current benefits that are in place right now and not for some future increase in benefits. The present value of the increased contributions that are in the proposed agreement, which take us from 7% up to 9% for current employees, is worth about $20 million in today's dollars. And that was a number that we were provided by Milliman, and he can talk more to that. And then we'll go into the 2.4 versus 2.2 billion, and that's the 90% number that you've heard about. So 90% of the actuarial accrued liability of 2.4 billion is tied up in already earned benefits that you've heard from various legal counsel we cannot touch legally. That is the advice that we are under. That is based on several opinions. Jim Lynn will talk about that more. So out of the 2.4 billion, again, 90% is tied up in already accrued, already earned benefits. Robert, do you have anything to add?
No.
Okay. So getting into the breakdown of the 2.4 and 2.2 billion dollars, you'll see that I've categorized the 2.2 billion as untouchable based on what we've heard here today. 1.7 billion of that is due to current retirees and the participants in drop. That puts the number to what you heard Chris and Jim talking about. So 1.7 billion is already accrued, already earned benefits to people who are already considered retired or are retired and no longer working. Yes?
Just to go back, just to make sure I'm clear, from what Mr. Lynn said, we could make prospective, in his opinion, we could make prospective increases in required contribution of existing unvested, unretired. But that's part of the, that's part of the 20%, not the 10%, not the 90%.
The change in the employee contributions does not affect the liabilities. All it would do would affect what the city pays versus what the employees pay. The liabilities are just a measurement of how much benefits have been earned to date. And then when you fund it, then you start dividing it between employee and the city.
I was confused too, because what you do, you increase from 7% to 9%, 10% in two cases. But that's only over the next couple of years if you increase the salaries of those employees.
Okay, the 10% would affect all the future hires.
Right.
Okay, the 9% is, my understanding, is only when the police and fire have gotten back to their prior city levels, and then when they get pay raises above that, you're going to get up to half of their pay raise, but no more than 2% may go to the plan.
So that legally we could, for example, recommend we go back and negotiate more of an increase without regard to whether we get it. But that's a question, that's an issue that they would have to consent to. Existing.
That's a legal question, not an actuarial question.
Yes, if we were able to get more things than we were able to bring to you, this is the deal we were able to get. But legally, you could ask for more. And while I can't tell you what went on mediation, this was the result of an agreement. So there isn't a legal prohibition against going forward. Now, if this were labor, which it isn't, but ironically, if I win that argument, if this goes away and we go into litigation, I win it, it's a labor issue, you can't impose an increased contribution. So you would have to wait till you're done with all of your litigation with the unions before you could increase the contributions. And that all of that plays into what's the appropriate number. Also the 9%, if you look at the state, which we're competing with FRS, they have a 3% contribution and 6% to get their Social Security. And so while they get two things for their 9%, it still is a 9%, it still gives you something that you can argue is comparable. And that's just kind of the logic. But yes, you could legally increase it. That's not the impediment.
Any other questions for Robert on this topic?
Yes, sir. Sure. I want to cover that on $200 million. I keep wrestling my mind exactly how that is calculated. If I can try to simplify it for my simple mind. If we have an existing employee that, let's say, has 10 years of service, and on the present plan, they accrue 3% a year. So they would have a 30% accrual. And if their salary were $50,000 a year, they would accrue a $15,000 benefit at some point in the future when they retire. Is that $200,000 based upon that employee's calculation today, or does that also include a future contribution, assuming that that employee was making, when they retire 15 years from now, they'll be making $75,000, and they will have accrued a benefit of 80%. So are you calculating the future accrual, or is that just what they've earned today?
Okay, the $15,000 amount you calculated is referred to as an accrued benefit. It's what they've earned to date. The actuarial liability is more of a funding number, and it really represents the present value of benefits based on potential future salary increases, future service, working more years. You can, leave, you can retire, you can quit, you can become disabled, minus what you expect to get and what we refer to as future normal costs. The normal cost is kind of like the true cost of the plan each year. Assuming you didn't have an unfunded liability, the city's contribution each year, what the benefits being earned, would be the normal cost. So you kind of divide it into what you expect to get from what you're going to earn in the future. You take the present value of that, and the value of the benefits that have been promised minus that becomes your actuarial liability.
So is the $500 million due in current vested benefits, that's that $15,000 example I used, and the $200 million is due to actuarial estimates of future increases in benefits because of increases in salary and the average pay.
Close to that, okay? Really, the active actuarial liability is $700 million. So that's really the A minus the B, the future minus. So in theory, even if you get rid of the actuarial liability, you still have the 15,000 or the 500 million, which becomes accrued that you can't get rid of. So technically, they're kind of like overlapping numbers, but essentially the city has committed itself to $2.2 billion, based on what Mr. Lynn has said, that you either have accrued benefits that you cannot walk away from.
I'm confused by the statement that the $200 million can only be eliminated through a complete freeze of the plan. Because the freeze of the plan, I know the next page you talk about you have to fund up the plan, et cetera. So I'm a little bit confused that it can only be eliminated through a complete freeze. It seems to be inconsistent with the ability to change prospectively in terms of the plan. It seems like that's $200 million.
Well, I think, could you go to the next slide? Okay. The wording, we were very careful in the wording there. It says can only be eliminated by a freeze of the plan. You could lower the 200 million if the city prospectively reduced benefits for the current police and fire. Say they cut the accrual rate. The current accrual rate is 3% for the first 20 years. Say they reduce that for any future year of service was reduced from 3% to 2%. That $200 million would come down, but the only way you can completely eliminate it is to go to zero on future benefit.
Elimination, but we obviously we cannot and should not touch the accrued benefits, which is a $500 million. Earn that at the 3% a year accrual. That's locked in. It's done legally and morally. That's not going to work.
That's what. Yep. That's the lawyers have said.
Is there a difference in that accrued, whether they're vested or unvested?
It's a very small difference. Vesting under the current plan is 5 years. The city has just not hired many police and fire over the past 5 years. And as said earlier, the accrued only looks at salary and service to date, so there's no perspective in it.
And just to tag on to that, that kind of gets into what Chris was talking about. So 200 million is further reduced. If you start thinking about just fundamental fairness of granted benefits in the past, you start trying to tweak the $200 million. If you grandfather in people who have, say, 5 years to retirement, 10 years to retirement, I don't know where you draw the line, but the majority of that pent-up liability, the needle-moving portion, would be to the people who are closest to retirement, which are likely, again, can't talk a lot about what happened in mediation, but the hardest to move, the hardest to change. If you grandfather that in, that $200 million, I don't know what it goes down to, but it's probably a much smaller figure, being that, again, we haven't hired a lot of people in the last 5 years. So there's not a lot of people who, when you're only, well, it takes 20 years to earn retirement and you grandfather in 10, you've only got a small window of people to impact. So there wasn't a lot of, there's not a lot of juice to squeeze there in a lot of cases.
One thing that, to your point, I don't think there's much there, but if you looked at in fairness issue, if they were unvested, so there was a 5 or under, and you put them to the new employee hire deal, 2.5 and higher contribution rate, what difference would that make? Quantify that as 10 or 20 million. That's what you arguably have given on the table.
We have not really looked at that specific group of employees, the ones with less than 5 years of service. But as I said, since they only have less than 5 years, the biggest of their pension is probably 4 years times 3%, which is 12%. They're probably at the bottom of the pay scale. So, and they're also the youngest, which makes their present value probably the smallest. So there would not be probably much of an impact. There would be additional savings, but it would not be a fairly large number.
Okay, and I think this next slide is somewhat beating a dead horse at this point. Is the $1.2 billion in savings real? As Chris pointed out, that number has been confirmed by 2 actuaries, the actuary for the pension board itself and Robert Dizzuti with the Milliman Group, who's done the work here for us during this process. All it is, the $1.2 billion, if you add up all of the reductions in contributions that the city would have to come up with over the next 30 years, you come up with $1.2 billion in lower contributions into the pension fund. And as we've talked about earlier, and as shown in the 5-year presentation that I gave you of what I would forecast based on the numbers provided by our actuaries, $100 million of that is in the next 5 years. That's a pretty big portion. Some of what I have read and heard and seen people talking about is that a lot of this doesn't come into play until down the road. Well, if you compare what we will have to do if pension reform doesn't go through with what we will have to do when pension reform goes through, there is dramatic reduction and immediate budgetary impact over the next 5 years. We also did a discounting analysis throughout this process. There's a lot of talk about what discount rate is the right rate. Everybody's got their own opinion on that. Should we use 7%? Should we use 7.25? Should we use the graduated scale that we've baked into the plan? Or should we use the cost of financing city operations, which is probably somewhere in the 3s or 4s? All are reasonable estimates. All produce very different numbers. The one that I feel to be most reasonable and probably the best starting point is the actual rate of return assumed by the plan. It's the most easily tiable back. And that produces about $350 million. And basically what that says is that the value of adopting this pension reform is a transfer of wealth from the future public safety employees and a little bit from current to the taxpayer of about $350 million. Significant reform and good deal, in my opinion. So why not convert to defined contribution, or DC, which many of you may be familiar with my past service at Merrill Lynch. Ending about 3 years ago, I had a DC plan, I had a 401k. Why don't we do that? In theory, it is great, it's good to have, and if starting from a clean slate, you better believe we'd probably be looking at something like DC. It would be an option that would be on the table. This is something that we have looked at, we've dedicated significant thought to, and I know the administration was dedicating thought to it long before I was brought in. It's just something that has been deemed not practical, and Robert can talk more about why. In fact, why don't I let Robert talk more about why, what challenges we would have to actually implement a DC plan at this time.
Okay. Well, one of the points, as Jim indicated earlier, was the state has rules and regulations that govern the funding of the local pension plans. So you don't have as much freedom as you might have on the private sector side. And they would require, more than likely require, two things. One of the things now is when the unfunded liability, which is the $2.4 billion in liability minus the $1 billion or so in assets, you have $1.4 billion of unfunded liability. That's being amortized over what we call a level percentage of payroll, which is unlike a house mortgage. The idea is the payments are going to go up, I'm doing this from memory now, 3.25% a year. I may be off just a tad, but they're going to go up as payroll goes up and the budget, as the city's budget go up, so they stay constant as a percentage. So what you have is lower payments now that are steadily increasing. The state would probably require you to switch to what we call level dollar amortization, which most of you are familiar with because that's if you had a mortgage, you pay the same amount every year. The only difference is probably property taxes or insurance. And so your payments are level. Now, these two streams of payments have to have the same $1.4 billion value today. So if we're using a stream of payments like this, we're going to stay level. The initial payments have to be much higher to get you the same present value dollars. You would ultimately, 15, 20 years out, save money. The payments would be less, but you would have to pay a lot more money now. The other thing is, in the valuation, they're essentially assuming, the police and fire actuaries started assuming that the whole unfunded would be paid off over 23 years. So it's a 23-year mortgage versus a 30-year mortgage for a house. It is possible the state would say for a defined contribution plan, since you don't have any more future employees coming into the defined benefit plan, so your workforce is going to shrink, that they may say, we want you to fund it over a shorter period of time. It's just like anything, if you switch from a 30-year mortgage to a 15-year mortgage, same interest rate, your payments are going to go up. So that would also increase the payment. So the city contributions in the short term would go considerably higher. And also for a defined contribution plan for police and fire, you're probably looking at a contribution rate that's FRS, I believe, is somewhere around 14% for their special risk. So you're looking roughly, a number comparable to that, maybe a little bit lower, but Social Security is 6%, 6.2.
You indicate, I guess, are you going to the last slide? I'm presentation.
With the permission of the chair, we were actually going to jump to the last slide next. We've kind of talked about the next two significantly, so we'll talk about that and then open up to any questions. We've talked about current employee contributions. Chris, I think, did a pretty good job in stating that and I talked about it earlier too, that we did move through this proposal current employee contributions from 7% to 9%. It is subject to a couple little elements of the agreement that as their payroll gets restored to the levels before they took their pay cuts, from that point forward, then any raises would go to help increase the contributions into the pension fund. So it may take a little bit of time to fully take effect, but 8 years, 10 years from now, 12 years from now, I don't know when that's going to happen, but at some point we're going to be sitting here with a police and fire pension system in which all employees at that time would be paying in 9 or 10%, depending on whether or not they were hired before the implementation of this plan or after the implementation of this plan. We've been using 10-1 of 13, but it's up to the city council and the board at that point. The last slide we wanted to talk about was we wanted to really hammer home how important and how big of a deal the unfunded liability is with what we're facing. We've prepared charts, we've seen charts that talk about, that kind of show the scale of what this reform is versus what we would look like without it. And it shows that steadily increasing line of city contributions due to the pay down on the unfunded liability, which makes up the majority of our payment on pension. This year, in 2013, fiscal year 2013, that ends on 9/30, so September 30 of this year, we're paying in 81.91% of pay into the police and fire pension system for benefits. Just as a quick side note, in the 10-1-12 valuation, which the Police and Fire Fund did adopt at their June meeting. That number goes up to 110.85% of payroll. But to simplify it, to use this year's example of 80%, let's say, just to make it simpler, 50% is just to pay down the already accrued debt in the pension system, the debt that we can't do anything about through any aspect of pension reform. That is off the table. We have to pay it. It's like a bond that we've issued. We have to pay it down, or we would default on it. And under what scenario could we default on that? Good luck finding out. I would leave it to the attorneys. I don't know where, when you look at Fitch's report, and we've had a couple of good, otherwise we're listed as a very strongly managed city, very soundly managed financial city. With this one problem, I think it would be very difficult to do something like that. But 50% on the payment of the debt, 30% on the benefits that are being earned this year. One quick point to make, that's actually 34%, but just due to the simplistic rounding I used, we're using 30. But the actual savings from adopting this plan for future employees, it takes the normal cost. So if you factor out the unfunded liability payment of 50%, you get to 34%, which is to fund the currently accruing benefits in the plan. That's pretty high compared to the 10% that this will now go down to for future employees. You're not going to find that written down in this presentation, but the normal cost, and Robert Duzubi can talk more about this if you'd like, is going from 34% down to 10 when you factor in that we have an allocation from state chapter funds that's going to make the cost of providing benefits to new public safety employees in line with Social Security, which many from the private sector are familiar with, is 6.2%. So it's taking us down to about 6. And that's the impact from adopting the pension reform to the cost of benefits. So Robert and I can entertain any questions at this time.
That last slide was very helpful. The first time I saw the 80% of payroll, it was like a shocking number. And I think part of the confusion about this whole issue is the combination of the unfunded pension liability obligation and the current benefits being provided to employees. Those people, when they see the 80%, think we're providing a benefit to our police and firemen equal to 80% of payroll, which is simply not true. It's just a calculation of the total contribution compared to payroll. So I think that's a very misleading factor in that computation. If tomorrow manna came down from heaven and we funded 100% the unfunded liability, so that issue's off the table. And to me, it's the combination of the unfunded and the current contributions. Okay, what piece of it goes to what? If that were totally funded, what would be the annual contribution to the plan, and what percentage of that of payroll?
Oh, well, I don't know in dollars, but it would be somewhere between 34 and 35% of payroll, which would be the normal cost. And the city is getting 4.58% of that in premium tax rebates from the state. So the net amount would be about 30% of payroll. And if payroll is
140.
1 billion, it would be, what's that, 42 million?
Well, payroll's about $140 million roughly,
Okay.
just around.
So when you look at this, that to me is an important number. When you look at the chart that was in the Time Union and charts of information you provided, you see this huge number going out there. But if we were totally funded now, if all the sins of the past were miraculously removed, and the only thing we're dealing with is contributions to fund current accrued, current and future benefits for the police and fire, then that contribution would be 42 million. 40 million, right? 40 million. And if you're looking back, in 2002, 2003, that number was 10 million. But it's not 10 million compared to 160 million. Because we didn't really have much of an unfunded liability back in 2002, 2003. So that to me is an important fact to understand, that it's the unfunded, if you pull that unfunded liability out of the contribution, okay, what are we really paying for the benefits for our current police and fire employees? It's a whole lot smaller number. Most people don't think quite understand all the history about this.
I've read somewhere, I don't remember where, but have y'all been talked about paying that unfunded liability off in one fell swoop, issuing bonds that you can fix your payments over a period of time.
We have looked into that. We've thought about it. It's been recommended to us along with many insurance type ideas too. There's been a lot of product recommended to us to help solve this problem. The way the administration, and a lot of this took place before I became involved, but I've become very familiar with it and very aware, looked into different options, but decided, and Chris can step up here and stop me and correct me if I'm wrong, made a decision that we would want to pursue structural, real reform in place of considering things that would potentially downplay the problem. To answer your specific question, pension obligation bonds, if applied perfectly, may not be a bad thing. It's an arbitrage play. You go out and borrow at 4 or 5%. We'd have to borrow taxable, and then you reinvest it at presumably the rate of return assumed by the plan of 7.25 for the long term. Going back to my experience at Merrill Lynch, again, where I dealt with many individual clients, a lot of which are just people, just like you and me. You're subject to emotion, fear, greed. You don't always make decisions at the right time. When would we most likely decide to implement pension obligation bonds? Robert and maybe Jim and others who have been in the pension business for a long time may be able to give you examples of cities and states who have done pension obligation bonds. That didn't always work out. In fact, it probably works out less often than you think, and probably, I'm just guessing, but probably less than half the time. It's leverage to the plan, and as with any type of leverage, if you apply it correctly, it can work out. If you apply it incorrectly, it can magnify the pain of your situation.
Is that something that you could consider outside of this agreement, Joe? Because the unfunded liability is going to stay. So a year from now, you might say, well, it would be as
And let me address that in two ways, and to kind of elaborate on what Joey said. The idea of a pension obligation bond or a pension liability reduction bond, it's branded in a variety of different ways, was suggested to us, and we'll send this around to the committee. There's actually been some study and analysis done of these around the country, as Joey alluded to, with very mixed results, and in some cases with very negative results. That was not a risk that we felt like we could take with the Police and Fire Pension Fund having the level of unfunded liability that it was. And again, we'll circulate some of these materials to you so you have a sense of that. Cindy or Jim can answer the question as to whether or not we consider that outside the terms of the agreement. From a purely financial and sort of benefit risk standpoint, it has not been something we've been in favor of just because of the potential risk engaged in doing that.
Yes, with regard to pension obligation bonds, the City Council retains the power to put a cash infusion in. You'd want to negotiate the terms under which it came in at any time. We reserve that to you. I would point out that $1.4 billion of debt, if you the only available pledge you have is ad valorem, likely to be a GO bond, which requires a referendum. So if you had the money to pay the debt, we wouldn't be in the conversation. And it's 1.4 billion. But that's, I think, subject to a second study, and the manner in which you reduce your debt is always within the province of the City Council.
Okay. Other questions?
In the examples that you cite where pension obligation bonds are negative, what things happen that we're not expecting that would make that?
Sure. Let's just talk about right now. If we were to go out and borrow money at 4.5% or so, with it, 4 or 5% taxable. I don't know exactly what rate we would get, but let's use that for example. We go out and we then invest it in the pool of investments comparable to what the Police and Fire Pension Fund is set up now. I don't know who would control that money. I don't know if it would get dedicated right to the Police and Fire Pension Board, or if there would be a trust set up, or how it would operate. But theoretically, you borrow the money and then you go invest it. We've had a great 3 to 4 years since the depths of the financial crisis I believe March of '09 was the bottom. If you look at, and I think this will answer a question I heard earlier too, the returns of the fund, over that time period, the Police and Fire Pension Fund has returned, I believe, north of 12%. It's probably closer to 14% per year since the bottom. And over the last year, it's closer to 20 or 22%. And I'll circulate a performance report to the group too in our next communication with you. But with the market having run up off of that bottom, we all know that markets move in cycles. If we pick the wrong time, if we invest today and a year from now, the market is down 30%, we will have leveraged a negative return. So we will have borrowed at 5. We were supposed to make 7 or 7.25, and we made a negative 30 on the money. That would be a dramatic negative impact.
And I'd like to talk further about that.
Sure.
Let's see, you have in the package, I think everybody has a letter from Mr. Zuby to you. And in it, at the end, of course, I like charts, so I guess right to the charts. And so if you know what I'm talking about.
If you start talking about the chart, I'm sure I could remember it, or maybe Robert can.
Cumulative savings, baseline versus new plan grade.
Yeah, and Robert's got it here too, so we're pulling
We're
it up.
hoping.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, so it's the second last page in that tab, and it's the second. Third tab. Looks like it. You got it?
And we've got that too, Greg.
You got it too, okay, so, baseline for fiscal year 14 is, do I see that $147,000?
140.
147 million.
Okay, about a million.
Yeah.
So that represents our contribution for the police and fire department.
That's correct, for the upcoming fiscal year.
That's under the baseline. Okay. And so under the new plan, this chart says that in the first year, that amount is $103 million.
That's correct.
So you agree with that?
Yes.
All right, great. So if you move over just 2 years to fiscal year 16, okay, what would the new plan contribution be?
I believe that says 147
No. Did you say?
million versus 153.
Which year did you say?
This is 16, fiscal year 16.
It's 100
And
and,
the new plan grade, what would that be?
147 million.
no.
The new plan
If we
grade.
did nothing right now, this year, what would the contribution be?
153 million.
No.
If we did nothing 3 years for fiscal 16,
If I understand your question is, under the new plan, 2 years from now, you'll be at the 147 million roughly that you are now. But the 147 million will have increased.
And then if you just skip forward under the new plan for fiscal year 19, what would that number be? 165 million? Okay. My eyesight is not the best, and these are small numbers. You know, I think I made my point.
Yeah.
and then through the chair to the other chair, I would just direct your attention to the 5-year forecast that I've provided to you. That breaks down the police and fire, general employees, and corrections over the next 5 years. And that's where I was talking about the savings over 5 years being $100 million.
Any other questions? I don't want to get into the weeds on it, but can you just, where do we stand on our other, we're not as, from what I read, we're not as in bad shape. And we've got the general employees, are we going to be doing this again next year? One of those others?
And Mr. Chairman, the legal people can speak as well, but there are 4 general employees unions. Obviously, one key difference between public safety employees and general employees is there is no 30-year agreement that's a sort of intervening factor. with two of the general employees unions, those being AFSCME and the Jacksonville Supervisors Association, JSA. We have reached tentative retirement reform agreements, which frankly look much like the one before you. One of those unions has ratified them. I'm not sure if the other one has or not yet. Those will ultimately come to City Council. We are still in the process with the other two unions, those being LIUNA and the Communication Workers of America. Those are still in the what is called PERC, Public Employees Retirement Commission process right now. So we have agreements with two general employees unions, not with the other two.
But is the unfunded liability on that the same sort of problem that we've got?
Not nearly as large. Mr. Gravy, who's actually the expert who deals with these with the general employees, can speak to it more specifically. But I'll just, as a short example, in your materials you've received before, you saw the Leroy Collins Institute's municipal pension study. The general employees plan received a much higher grade than the police and fire pension plan. So the problem is not nearly of the same magnitude. He can probably speak to it with specificity, but yeah.
Other questions?
Why do you think that other municipalities and states that believe that the contribution is higher? What's different about our situation? That's been a solution that's been applied.
Defined contribution has not been a big success in public sector plans. It's in the right in the private sector. I would agree that most of America now has 401ks and defined contribution plan, but in the public side, several states have tried and very few have succeeded. Florida now gives all its members of FRS a choice whether to go into defined contribution or defined benefit. They're averaging between 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 people are going into the defined contribution. West Virginia in the late 80s, early 90s had a very worse unfunded plan than the Jacksonville Police and Fire. They switched to defined contribution, and somewhere around 2005, 2008, they had to switch back to defined benefit because they found their teachers did not have enough benefits to retire on. It's just not been an unsuccessful push, especially in, I want to say, the Northeast, maybe the Midwest, where you have more unionized pensions. Usually they will not go, and that's even on the private sector side. Usually the unions are the last ones to go for the defined contribution. I believe Nebraska may have switched back from defined contribution to defined benefit. There are some smaller cities that have done it, but it's just not been a big push on in the local government side. There may be a couple cities in Florida that have done it.
So have there been success stories using the model that you're different towns have?
That's an interesting question. There have been a lot of cases where new tiers of benefits have been put in for future government employees just because it's easier. You don't have to negotiate with your current employees, you're just future hires that you're not worrying about. I believe something like New York City or New York State may have 4 or 5 tiers of benefits now. One of the fears or one of the things that may happen is when 20 years from now, when most of your employees are in the new plan of benefits, and as this was alluded to earlier, the city and the employees can negotiate back up to higher benefits. There are also some, and again on the private sector, I don't know if you're familiar, there are types of defined benefit plans called cash balance plans, which really are a defined benefit plan that looks like a defined contribution plan. And really what it is, your defined benefit plan, and most are called final average pay plans. Benefits are based on the last 5 years. So benefits are based on your salary when you retire or quit. Another type of defined benefit plan is a career average, where your benefit is based on your whole work history, your whole salary history. So it does not entirely reflect your salary when you retire. A cash balance, a defined contribution plan, if you think about it, you get a contribution every year based on that year's salary. So it's kind of like a career average plan, because Obviously, your salary when you're 60, if you're at the same company, it's going to be usually a lot higher than the salary when you were at age 30. A cash balance plan is the same idea as the defined contribution plan, where you get a contribution every year into a hypothetical account. The big difference is in a defined benefit plan or a cash balance plan, the interest rate you earn each year is fixed. It's tied usually like to 30-year T-bills or something, where in a defined contribution plan, it's tied to how well you invest the money. You can go down or up.
Mr. Lynn, looks like he wants
Let me just say something about the defined contribution. I've probably worked with 40 or 50 cities in Florida in the last 3 years, which have gone through pension reform in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of discussion about DC plans in Florida from the state on down. I mean, you saw the state legislature grappling with that issue this year. It didn't pass. It might pass next year. So far in Florida, no city has implemented a defined contribution plan for police and fire. It's not to say that that couldn't happen, and there's different reasons for why it hasn't happened, but the fact remains that it hasn't happened. Now, there are a number of cities in Florida that have gone to DC plans for general employees, and the typical way of doing that is to put new hires in a DC plan. But thus far, it just hasn't happened at the local level or at the state level for public safety employees. So.
The reasons why police and fire pension funds have not gone to DC, why?
Well, one reason is what was talked about earlier here, which is the cost, the upfront cost of closing or terminating your current plan and going to a DC plan, either for current employees or just for new hires. It's going to increase. I mean, I've probably seen 20 studies in different places of this, and they all show the same thing, and it's just a matter of how many years you're going to pay more before the costs start dropping off. And most cities, when faced with that immediate budget, they're looking for immediate savings, not, okay, we're going to be willing to pay more for a certain number of years before the cost comes down. That's probably the number one reason. The number two reason, well, it's been a good reason for a number of cities that have looked at it.
If it's better than kicking the can down the road?
Is it better than kicking the can down the road? Well, what those cities have ended up doing is a lot of the same kinds of changes that you're talking about here, where they've kept their current plans so that their immediate costs don't go up, and they've scaled back benefits so that there's a savings over time. Probably the second main reason that more cities or any cities haven't gone to DC plans is because nobody wants to be the first to do that.
I think that the answer is to follow up on this 34% of pay. That 34% is the city's contribution. That does not include either the paid or 10% of paid contribution of an employee.
Correct. Correct.
So obviously, the city does not contribute to Social Security for the police and fire employees. So that's 6% off the top. And a defined contribution plan, you typically, even a generous one, you would see a company making a contribution of anywhere from 4 to 5% of pay. So that takes that 6% to around 10 or 11% or something like that. Unquestionably, police and fire duties and responsibilities are more dangerous and more demanding than, say, general population center. There would be a risk premium that you certainly justify to go into that. But, you know, if you're at 10 or 11% and you put something on there, this is, even if you add, you know, if you increase it by 50% to a 15% contribution, that's still only about half of what the city's contribution is under the present benefit, as adjusted, not present, as adjusted, I'm sorry, is 34% the revised plan or the existing plan?
Existing plan,
And it goes to what under the proposed plan?
somewhere between 10 and 11%.
Okay, so the 10, 11% then is somewhat equivalent to a 6% social security contribution and a 4 or 5% 401k type contribution. The only difference being is the city's taking the risk on the investment return under the defined benefit, and the defined contribution the employee is taking.
Yes. I mean, well, Social Security is also a little bit different, but yes.
I think all of us would be willing to put 6% away for that future.
The only thing to tack onto that is that we need to remember too that we receive 4.58%, as Robert mentioned, from state chapter funds to help reduce that further. So whether it's the 34% you're looking at or the 10%, you need to lop off another 4 to get down to the actual normal cost to the city, because we do get those state chapter funds.
That's the statutory.
But that, I understand that part. But with the proposed changes, that becomes 10, the current benefit cost of the city would be 10 to 11%.
And then backing out the 4% takes you down to between 6 and 7%, which is the actual normal cost that we will bear.
Yeah. Rob?
Well, he answered the question. 34% is a better contribution for the employee than the defined contribution plan, which would be far less. And no matter how much the employer, the city, wants to put into the kind of plan, right?
And to answer your question, just like I talked about earlier, if we were starting with a clean slate, then you're making a great point, and that is why we would do, or at least strongly consider, DC, defined contribution. But given the challenges of doubling or tripling our current 126 million or 148 million, whichever one you're looking at, going up to 250, 300 million for the upcoming fiscal year, we just can't do that.
Well, y'all confused me because you've reduced the contribution, the share of the city to 6% when you take into account the enhancement plan, compared with Social Security plus 4%. So actually, this is better than that defined contribution. Not compared to the 34%, but compared to the 10% plus. Is that right? I think I may need the numbers from the room. That's what I thought.
That sounds like a reasonable comparison to me.
Okay, so Bob, I just want to make that clear that you're not comparing 34 to 10, you're comparing 6 to 10. Because I understand.
But the difference is you have the investment risk under the defined benefit. Correct. That you do not have in the defined benefit. But the actual cost of current benefits, if I understand you correctly, for the proposed amendment would be in line, before the contribution would be in line with what we consider a generous 401k benefit of around 10 or 11%.
And I don't know if the sheriff's come in yet. He may be able to speak, because what the other part of the defined contribution, as I understand it, I'm in the private sector, is the ability to attract workers. And I don't know the answer to that, but I've heard that that's an issue. So maybe the sheriff, are we, again, thinking of the time, because I want to...
Can I just answer that?
Time for Mr. Halverson also. So are we through with this part of the...
Can I just respond to your statement? One of the issues with defined contribution plans for public safety employees is public safety employees are more likely to either suffer an unfortunate death while working or line of duty disability where they can't do their job anymore. And if the only benefit they have is a defined contribution account, it's not going to provide them an adequate income. It won't provide anybody an adequate income usually. So onto the cost of any defined contribution plan, while Social Security would provide some disability and death benefits, you still have to provide some long-term disability coverage and some pre-retirement death coverage. The state of Florida does it through life insurance, and then in addition to the defined, for those who elect into the defined contribution, there's an additional contribution that goes towards the defined, towards providing disability benefits. And if somebody in the defined contribution plan becomes disabled, they are allowed to forfeit their account and transfer into the defined benefit plan and get the benefit as if they were in the defined benefit plan the whole time.
As if they can.
Yeah, but there's a contribution for that.
Just along those lines, and we didn't really talk much about it or hear much about it so far, but I know under the proposal, it's contemplated or proposed that the disability pension be cut by about 10%. And I'm just curious, given that it would be cut from 60 to 50, how much of the savings is coming from that?
We did not look at each element of the proposal separately, but one of the things we noticed was that the disability benefits, let me phrase this different, excessive disability retirements are not currently a problem in the police and fire plan. So it's not like, it's not being abused. So there would be some small savings from going from 60 to 50%, but the assumption as to how many disabilities occur is fairly small based on when the police and fire actuary studied from 2006 to 2011.
And that was sort of my assumption. I'm just curious that if there's not so much savings being realized from that, why cut that benefit given sort of the high risk and special risk of this workforce from 60 to 50%?
And Ms. Doodle, that was entirely consistent. That change in the disability benefit was something that was in 2011-400, Mayor Payton's retirement reform plan. Again, kept consistent as part of this retirement reform plan, agreed to by both sides. So again, that's something that's been sort of consistently discussed over time. One other thing I wanted to mention, just as we're kind of wrapping up, because I know we need to get the sheriff and the fire chief, but one thing to keep in mind as we go through this exercise is these decisions obviously aren't made in a vacuum. There was a set of facts and liabilities that existed before we tackled this issue, and I also encourage you not to look at it in a vacuum from this sense. Because of the way the law is, and Jim and Cindy described this, any changes we make have to be the source of an agreement. There are multiple parties involved depending on the legality of it, who they are. So just keep that in mind. The one thing I would just, and I know that we're just going back and forth here and kicking around different ideas, our strong position is that this is not kicking the can down the road, that these are major significant benefit changes that in some ways far exceed what the Florida retirement system does. So we do view this as a comprehensive solution, but you also have to view it in the overall context of there were certain facts on the ground when we first tackled this in terms of what the unfunded liability of the plan was, what the history of the city's contribution would be, and due to the fact that this gets implemented through agreement. And there's a back and forth between the sides to end up at a particular solution there. Just in the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, were there any other legal questions for either Ms. Lacadera or Mr. Lynn? Obviously not the last opportunity to quiz them on this, but before the chairman moves to Sheriff Rutherford and Chief Centerfit, I just wanted to make sure that those have been answered.
I do have one question. We didn't cover this probably in part of the presentation, but on the governance provision changes in the plan. I understand the genesis of the lawsuit between the pension fund and the city, but I don't recall seeing in that particular lawsuit the issue about I don't know what I want to call it, the private pension plan that was adopted for several of the executives of the pension fund. Now, I'm curious as to why that would be part of the settlement. It seems to be totally separate from the benefits, to the rank and file employees of the police and fire departments of the city. That seems to be an odd thing that's settled as part of that process.
Thank you for that question. You have to go back in time. There's a perception that this was a dispute with the fund over benefits. If you look at the history of this, it originated with a governance dispute in 91, continued through 98 in terms of how do we apply the chapter funds and how are we managing the fund. And if you go back through all of those amendments that the city council, previous city councils had made, it was over governance and management of the funds, and then they started to creep in some of these changes, which again can give them the right to see how they're managing, what money's coming in and what money's going out. So in that context, we were trying to address governance issues as a whole. In the complaint, I can send you the complaint, cross-claim, and my defense and affirmative defenses. We say they breached their fiduciary duty in the manner in which they handled it, which then raises the retirement fund issue. And so you don't want to settle, like in any other business dispute, part of it and still be swinging at each other. The city pays the attorney's fees, the police and fire pension fund. Mr. Keene would have been entitled to either a senior management retirement computation under FRS or an administrative police and fire computation. Those were about 3%. So basically this was math. And we did the math. And while we like to win, ultimately I look at this as money and fungible. And when you put all that together, it was a marginal difference. So sweeping it all in, resolving all the disputes and getting forth together with them back in their fiduciary role, and the city council back in control of the city finances. Thank you.
Are y'all, I'm hoping y'all will be available at our other meetings too. Y'all have been very helpful.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, if I could, I just want to correct one thing that I said earlier, and it's a very small thing, but I want to make sure that I correct it. And that is, I said that drop participants do not contribute. And in fact, in this plan, they do contribute. They contribute 2%. So I just wanted to make that correction.
And to that point, it's unclear that if the contributions could be changed in that scenario, or those locked?
Well, I think that the way drop works, you can change the terms of the drop for people who have not yet gone into the drop. So, but once they, right.
All right, well, thank you all very much. It's now 4:25. Let's take a 15-minute break, and then the sheriff and the fire so we'll be come back at 20. Let's come to order tonight. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I will give you my remarks on how the whole pension situation is impacting my workforce at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. And to do that, I'd like to kind of put it in a kind of a context. You know, there's an old saying that vision without action is just daydreaming. But vision without action is chaos. And I can tell you, most police officers at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office right now feel that their careers are in chaos because they have no vision for what's going to be happening to the pension. They're uncertain about, as a result of that, they're uncertain about the city's budget. And because of that uncertainty and the chaos that has brought to their lives, what I'm beginning to see is the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office become what we in my business call a breeder agency. We actually hire, train officers, get them well trained, and then they go to other agencies where their professional careers are much more stable. They know what they're getting into. They know what their future is going to be. And what's created that is the fact that we laid off 48 police officers just a couple years ago. We laid off 92 community service officers. And I don't mean cut positions, I mean laid people off, gave them pink slips. We cut everyone's pay by 3%. We've had significant reductions in other budget areas, and they know about all of those. And that is That is a scenario, I think, that has created this very chaotic situation for police officers. And so, since 2010, I've lost 72 police officers to other agencies. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but I can tell you in my 39 years with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, we rarely, if ever, lost a police officer to another agency. Rarely, if ever. I just lost 5 SWAT officers to Colorado, all at the same time. I also lost 102 correctional officers in that same time frame. 102. Because they hear about budget cuts and they know that those budget cuts, if I'm going to spread them across the agency, the only way I can get them into corrections is to close a facility, the Community Transition Center. Lay officers off. That's the only place I can go now to make cuts. Because this has not been a one-year problem. I've been dealing with this since 2003. And as a result of that, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office has become a breeder agency. And I really first became aware of that acutely when we tried to, after we laid off, through our reduction in force, we laid off 48 police officers. When in the following budget year, as we had vacancies, we brought officers, we tried to bring officers back. Half of those officers who were offered a position back with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office refused that opportunity. Refused to come back because of the uncertainty. And I will close briefly with this. I know there was some discussion about defined benefit versus defined contribution. I can tell you a couple things about defined benefit that I like. I think it does help create stability. Because when they move, if they go to another agency, they only get their contribution. On a defined contribution plan, it actually costs you more if people leave early than it does if they leave under a defined benefit plan. And so that stability is what we're lacking. But make no mistake about this, a failure to resolve this pension issue, and I'm going to say even before this budget cycle, the only place I can go to make up $29 million is hundreds of police officers and correctional officers would have to be laid off. There is absolutely, I'm telling you, nowhere else to go in my budget. And I don't know another city, I don't know another police agency, I don't know another business of our size that can take a $64 million hit and survive and still provide the services that they're designed to provide. And with that, I'll close, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any questions? Sure. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Is Sergeant Right. Thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, glad to be here. Thank you for having me. Let me see if I can set this up so I can hold a mic and not drop everything in the process. Good afternoon. I really wanted to touch on 4 issues as they pertain to the fire department and public safety in Jacksonville and this pension reform talk. The first issue is that of recruitment and how it impacts us when we go out to recruit. First, we have to keep in mind that discussion of pension changes for new hires creates a lot of questions for the individuals that are applying. Individuals are wise today. They understand that it's not just how much you make per hour, but what is your compensation, your benefits, what's the package look like. A lot of people don't realize that, firefighters work a 56-hour work week. And so when I'm out there hiring a firefighter paramedic, I'm offering him $13.41 an hour. And if I can't tell her how much the benefit package is with that, What we know is private ambulance services and hospitals are paying upwards close $16, $17, even up to $19 an hour. And so when you look at the hourly rate, that $13.41 an hour, without being able to explain the benefit package, most individuals will back off and back away from the job. It's a big step for them. So, the real value for this type of job is the benefits. I can tell you myself, the reason I came to the fire department was not for the salary, but for the long-term benefit package. And if we cannot discuss that with the employees are staying away from us. Right now, we're almost 100 employees short on the fire department. We have a desperate need to hire. I do not need obstacles in that hiring process. And so that's the first challenge we face. The term I would say is uncertainty breeds a hesitancy to commit. People are staying away from us until this is resolved. The second issue I would bring up is that of retention. Anytime there are discussions, whether it's in the media, whether it's out in the open about discussions of cuts for current employees, it creates a huge issue for me on the fire department. First what starts happening is employees are leaving sooner than we expected them to leave. Yes, you can go on the retirement plan at 20 years on the drop plan, but in the past, people would wait till 30 years before they would drop. Now, as soon as they hit their 20 years, they're rushing in to sign that paperwork to get out the door because they're terrified that something is going to change and they're going to lose benefits. And so I'm seeing an exodus of experienced firefighters walking out the door. The other thing that's happening is the stress level is going up. We're seeing this in how people are behaving, how they're interacting with the public. The firefighters feel like they're under attack. And so the stress is going up, and that's creating problems in itself. That brings me to a very important issue that's occurring on the fire department right now, and that is the issue of morale. Firefighters, by their very nature, I always consider having what I refer to as a servant's heart. They get into this line of work because they want to help people. They want to be there when people have a need. But what's starting to happen is that image is changing. Now, the only time firefighters are discussed in the paper, it's when, we're talking about compensation. There's almost an attitude being applied to firefighters of greed or blame. The firefighters are the reason that the city's financial woes are the way they are. And that creates a huge issue because these are men and women out there that are doing all they can do to just protect the public. They did not create the problem, but they feel like they're the ones shouldering the blame. And that's really not a place that we need to be. It goes back to uncertainty breeds depression. When you don't know what your future holds, you cannot help but have an impact on your life. And that's what we're seeing out there. And then finally, let's talk just a moment about the operational impacts that are occurring on the fire department. The rising pension costs, building unchecked, are creating an absolute impossibility for my budget. It's taking more and more of my operational budget. Pension reform is critical, it's necessary, and it's critical immediately. The longer this discussion goes on, the more the problem compounds. In this current year's budget, this future budget that we're looking at, we're facing massive closures. We're not going to be able to staff the apparatus. If I'm expected to take a $10 or a $12 million budget cut to the fire department, it will be catastrophic, is the only word I can use to describe the public safety. So this has got a time sensitivity that is, I cannot overstress the sensitivity of getting this issue resolved in a timely manner. And last but not least, the more we spend talking about pension reform in the fire stations, the less we spend talking about how to do our job better. How can we better serve the public? This really has become a distraction to our operational efficiency in the fire department. And so I appreciate you stepping forward to take the time to look at this. This is a very real issue. It's a very critical issue, and it's an issue I hope we can resolve in a very timely manner. With that, any questions?
Chief, how do you think some of these factors would be impacted if the employee contribution rate was increased beyond what's been proposed, 9 and 10?
Are we talking for current employees or future?
Both.
Well, first, for current employees, the term I hear so often is promises made or promises kept. When the employees were hired, they were made what they feel were promises that if you work for us, we will give you this compensation package and you will pay this percentage. And so when you look at an employee who already has a business agreement with the city, and the city starts changing that agreement and raising the numbers on them, at what point in time do you lose confidence in your employer or in government? At that point in time, you have to start questioning, can I have faith that agreements made today are going to even hold water 10 years from now? And so we start eroding that government confidence and the confidence that employees have. You know, government jobs have always equated to stability. You know, people would come to the government, they would take slightly less money than the private enterprise, but they would have long-term stability. Now what we're doing is we're challenging the stability, and so I think that would be the issue. The other issue for new hires is it goes back to, remember, if we break it down per hour, you're talking $13.41 an hour. And then you look at that employee and say, by the way, we're going to take an even higher percentage of your pay to put towards your pension. At what point in time does the employee walk away and go get a job elsewhere? And I think that's what we would face.
Just a follow-up. I think one thing that would at least be helpful for me, and I don't know if anyone has done it, but it would be very helpful to look at, you know, firefighter, engineer, and so on and so forth, and look and see, you know, how their year, how their pocketbook is impacting their proposed change, contrasting with the current system in terms of the dollars that, you know, they're putting towards their pension, they're not putting, you know, in their family's immediate budget. Because I think we're talking about a lot of different changes to that benefit package, but I don't know that we've looked at, well, this is Rondo, he's currently making $64,000 a year under the former system, this is what his benefit package looks like. Under the new proposed system, this is what it would look like. I think that would be helpful from JSO and from JFRD.
I can appreciate that. The challenge is right now the package that's put forward has only an impact of percentage increase in what they have to pay. And so for current employees, there's not a major impact. For new employees, there would be. And we would have to, I'd have to work through HR to figure out what those numbers are.
Those are questions.
What advice would you have for us as a kind of, this is the problem for
Right. Well, the first thing I cannot emphasize enough is timeliness. This is not something that we have long periods of time to debate and discuss because the damage is occurring daily. And the damage is compounding. As we go into this next budget cycle, there's going to be a tremendous impact on service delivery. The second thing is what you're doing. You're hearing the facts. You know, when people hear that pension costs are 80+%, people assume the city's contributing 80% to the employees, and as we've just heard, that's not the case. You know, the percentage is much lower, but there's other numbers. There's too much rumor and speculation out there and not enough facts. And so getting the facts out, the real problems and what we're facing, I think is a big help to everyone. Because at the end of the day, I think the thing that's driving the morale down the most is firefighters are going out in the field and when they're interacting with the public, there are occasions they're being blamed for the city's financial woes. And to put the city's financial woes on the back of the employees is just ridiculous. And so as the facts come out, as we have these open and thoughtful discussions, then people start becoming a little more reasonable and they realize that this is a much bigger issue than just blaming one party or the other. And I think that's the way we can get to resolution. But timeliness is the most important thing. We have to move forward in a timely manner.
Any questions? Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And that last question reminded me, Mr. Alfie thought it might be helpful, Chris, or I guess Chris, if we could get a chart that would show take out the unfunded portion of the 80%, take the 34%, and show what the difference in contributions just for that would be with the, as it currently, without the plan, and with the plan. And also add to the bottom of that, what would happen in the defined contribution plan, assuming you could take care of the pay, I don't know how you do it. But you know what I mean, so we can see
Sure.
some comparisons to get to the chief's point of the 80%.
And Mr. Chairman, we're going to break that down for the committee, the task force, to share that information.
Okay, Steve Malverson, I think, is here, thank you, the city council, who's been engaged in this for longer than most of us. You might should be up here. But, I will say, Steve and I've had a couple of conversations, and he wasn't here at the beginning. I do want to say, as you know, we're all in this together, and everybody may have a different perspective, but it's all got the community's interest in heart. Paper, when I talk to my part, that's where they are, where y'all are, where we are, where mayor, city council, everybody's got that in mind. As an example, Steve and I talked about the facts, and he made the observation that the actuaries agree, the basic facts are agreed, was substantially agreed upon. So what we're really dealing with is the conclusions of people in good faith, taking all of this into account, just to believe that. And I appreciate all of us, but I also appreciate the work that y'all do. We'd love to hear anything.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the task force. What Chairman Shai said by way of introduction is exactly correct. We don't have much disagreement about facts. We have disagreement about characterization of those facts, and we certainly have disagreement about conclusions. But before I start with, and I'll be brief in my presentation, respecting the amount of time you've been sitting in those chairs and absorbing a lot of information. But before I begin the presentation, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the city team for its help for the Civic Council. They were generous with their time. They spent hours with us. They made their actuarial consultants and experts available to us, and we spent a great deal of time understanding the facts. And I can represent to you that, except for a couple things that are in this grander scheme of things rather immaterial, we do not disagree on the factual predicate. I would also be remiss if I didn't commend the city team for the work that it's done. This has been an issue that has been years and years in the making. They tackled it head-on in a straightforward way and did some good work. But as the title to my slide, and I'll ask Susie to pass out copies of that presentation if you don't have them. As the title says, we must do better, and that's the fundamental conclusion that the Civic Council's reached. Let me explain why. What I mean by that. That would require knowing how to drive this thing. I think I've figured out. As I mentioned, the key facts are not in dispute. I won't go through all these, but I would point out a couple of things that give some sense of context on the facts, because we view this as an extraordinarily serious issue. And I want to dimensionalize this a little bit for you. The pension obligations the city has currently, the numbers that you heard from the actuary are very high. They're north of $100 million already. This is against a city budget of $950 million, so it's in double digits of the percentage. If you went back in time, historically, the pension contribution was 1% to 3% of the city budget. Today in Florida, 2012, of all Florida cities, that number has increased to 4.1%, and it's viewed as a crisis. It's viewed as a crisis that it's that high. We're somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 times that. Clearly, that isn't a sustainable proportion of the budget to allocate to pension costs. Second point is, while this conversation is precisely focused on the public safety pension fund, as you've noted, the similar problem exists with the general employees fund. Nearly $1 billion deficit in that fund alone. And you need to think about that in the context of driving solutions. Not the precise task of this task force, but it's important context and backlog. Third point I'd like to make is you cannot look at pension contributions in isolation of everything else the city has to do. We have $1 billion, or less than $1 billion operating budget, and a great deal must happen within that budget. If pension obligations are absorbing double-digit percentages of that, it comes at the expense of everything else. And a question needs to be asked, is that a responsible stewardship of the public trust? Our answer is no. You've seen this before, the total pension costs continued to rise. I won't belabor that point any longer, nor am I going to be able to advance the slide any further. Oh, there we go. The current proposal, we suggest, is not a solution, not by a long shot, for a few basic reasons. First, it does not adequately retire the unfunded liability of roughly $1.5 billion. Second, the cost savings and they're commendable, but they're insufficient to restore the plan to solvency. Third, the assumptions embedded in the plan are, in our judgment, too optimistic, and they present too much risk to the city. Fourth, the agreement is too long. You heard the reasons for that, which was a proper characterization by Mr. Hand, but it is still too long. And lastly, and this is the most important point, and probably the most controversial point, the plan does not face what we think is the inescapable reality that new revenues need to be applied to retire this pension liability in order to provide essential service to the city and to restore the confidence and trust that our public safety officers must have in their pension plan. Now is the time to get all those things done.
Steve, before you go,
Certainly.
I can ask a question as well. Could you just give us some examples of the embedded assumptions for this? You may be going to, but would you comment on the...
Certainly, yeah. There are several that are there, and I will try not to get down too deeply into the weeds. They're all important, especially when you consider the length of a pension plan. The one I'll focus on, though, is the assumed rate of return that starts at 7.75% and declines to 7.25%. Mr. DeZubi, I think, would tell you that on the range and spectrum of assumptions in municipal plans, it is on the more conservative end, and he would be right about that. But that doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it responsible, and it doesn't make it free from risk. The city pension, the PF plan is funded 38%. You will struggle to find very many plans that are less securely funded than this one. It's at the very bottom of plans across the country. A 7.25% assumed return in this environment, and this is the opinion of a group of business people who most of them make a living making these kinds of judgments, is simply too risky. Simple way to test it for yourself is if I asked you to invest money for it, would you guarantee me a 7.25% return for 17 years? I don't think you would. The taxpayers deserve no less prudence and no less judgment as fiduciaries of those things. It's too high of an assumption. It needs to be lower, or the risk to the taxpayers and the risk to the pension fund is too great. That's the single biggest assumption that we think is imprudent. On top of that, you have all the other assumptions about salary growth and employment growth and things like that. We would judge them to be, and this is a judgment, not a fact, to be overly optimistic. All of those could go wrong, and all of those would have a deleterious effect on the funding of the plan if they're wrong. The point is that when you have a plan that is as underfunded as this one, you cannot afford risk. The longer the term of the agreement, the less risk you can absorb. The weaker the funding base, the less risk you can absorb. We are not in a position to absorb a great deal of risk, and how this plan is structured, and the proposed plan is simply too risky. I'll skip that second because I just covered that part. Second point relates to cost reductions. The city in its presentation pointed out that the bulk of the liability is fixed and untouchable, and that is fundamentally accurate. We would quarrel with them a bit about how much of the cost is addressable. I think Mr. Hand indicated it's $200 million. We think it's closer to double that. But in the end, that doesn't matter because it's not dimensionally enough to solve the problem. We do think a few things merit further discussion, and my dear friend the sheriff is armed, so I hope he doesn't exercise his weaponry this, but a few things that we think merit consideration. One is to increase employee contributions more aggressively than is proposed. That's painful. And it's difficult, but we think it's an essential element to consider. Second, to further reduce or even possibly eliminate COLA until the plan is fully funded. Again, a painful, hard thing to do, difficult going forward, but it ought to be considered. Things like that have a capacity to help shallow out this cost, but I would want to emphasize that in the context of the overall problem, it's not very much money, and it's not going to solve the problem, and you cannot cut your way to success on this, and you cannot cut your way to solvency. It looks like you have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, just to wrap that part of, because what we heard a lot of was, we've got to, and you and I talked about the legal constraints that we have with going with existing employees and asking them to contribute more